Please don't let them take me. Her fingers locked around his wrist, not begging. Not breaking, just holding on like a woman who had already survived everything except this moment. Behind her, 3 men on horseback crested the ridge. And the one in front was smiling. Ethan Caldwell had never seen a smile that cold on a man claiming to be the law. He looked down at her hand. Then he looked up at them. And something old and stubborn moved inside his chest. If you're new here, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. The riders didn't slow down when they reached the edge of Broken Creek property. They came through the gap in the old fence line, like men who had never once considered that a boundary might mean something. And the one leading them broad across the shoulders, wearing a tan vest over a white shirt that had no business being that clean this far out in ranch country, raised one hand in a lazy, practiced gesture, as if stopping a parade rather than confronting a man on his own land. Ethan didn't move. He had been fixing the water trough coupling when the woman came running. He still had the wrench in his hand. He hadn't put it down. "Morning," the man in the tan vest said, pulling his horse to a stop about 10 feet out. He had a deputy's badge pinned to his chest, but it was the kind of badge that caught light wrong, too bright. Too new, the kind a man buys rather than earns. "Name's Dolan. I ride for Commissioner Harland Voss. We're here on a recovery matter." "Recovery," Ethan repeated. "That woman." Dolan tilted his chin toward Clara without looking at her directly. Like she was property rather than a person. "She took documents belonging to Commissioner Voss. Legal papers, deed records, man wants them back, and he wants her brought in to answer for the theft." Clara's grip on Ethan's wrist tightened. Not from fear, he could feel the difference. It was fury. She was angry, and she was working very hard to keep it contained inside her skin. Ethan looked at her for the first time, with enough stillness to actually see her. Dark hair coming loose from its pins. A bruise forming along her left jaw that was fresh enough to still be swelling. Boots that had walked hard and fast over ground that hadn't been kind to them. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her eyes were the color of river water before a storm. And they were not the eyes of a thief. He had known thieves. He had known liars. He had looked into the eyes of men who burned down their neighbors' barns and then showed up the next morning to help clear the ash. This woman was not that. He turned back to Dolan. "She works for me," Ethan said. The words came out of somewhere he hadn't consulted first. They arrived fully formed, flat and certain, and he let them stand there without adding anything to soften them or explain them away. Dolan blinked. "Excuse me, I said she works for me. She's been at Broken Creek going on 3 days now. Helping with my books." He let that settle for a moment. "I don't know anything about documents or Commissioner Voss. What I do know is that 3 men riding hard onto my property to grab a woman is the kind of thing that requires more paper than a deputy's badge." One of the riders behind Dolan shifted in his saddle. The third one, younger, with restless hands, had moved his horse slightly to the left, not toward Ethan. Not exactly, but into a position that was not neutral. Ethan clocked it and said nothing. Dolan's expression didn't change. But something behind it did. "Commissioner Voss has a warrant," he said. "Then produce it." A pause. "It's being processed. Then come back when it's finished." Ethan held the wrench loose at his side, not threatening. Just present. "I'm not in the habit of handing my employees over to men who ride 3 to 1 and can't show their paper." The young rider with the restless hands said, "You don't know what you're getting into, mister." "Probably not," Ethan agreed. "But I know what's happening on my land right now. And I know how it ends if you don't turn those horses around." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a threat with elaborate language attached to it. It was just a man standing on his own ground, holding a wrench, telling the truth about consequences. Dolan studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, and the look he gave her was not the look of a man serving justice. It was the look of a man who had been told to bring something back to someone powerful, and who was calculating whether the cost of forcing the issue today was worth what he'd get for it. He decided it wasn't. "We'll be back," Dolan said. "I expect you will," Ethan said. They turned and rode back through the gap in the fence, and Ethan watched them until they were completely out of sight before he finally allowed himself to breathe. Clara let go of his wrist. He looked down at his arm. She had held on so hard that he could see the faint marks of her fingers in his skin. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be." She turned to face him fully. And now that the immediate danger had passed, something complicated moved across her expression, gratitude and suspicion and exhaustion all tangled together. And underneath all of that, the particular kind of pride that belongs to a person who has survived entirely on their own for too long. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't know if I took those documents, did you?" She looked at him steadily. "I took them because they were mine. Because they were proof. And because if I left them where they were, Harlan Voss would have destroyed them before sunrise." Ethan turned back toward the trough and picked up the coupling he'd set down. "You hungry?" She stared at him. "That's it? That's all you're going to say? I've got biscuits left from this morning and half a pot of coffee that's still warm enough. We can stand out here in the sun while you explain yourself to someone who already made up his mind. Or you can come inside and start from the beginning." He glanced back at her. "Up to you." Clara Bennett followed him inside. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and told him everything. Not quickly, she had learned to be careful with her words. To test the ground before she stepped on it. Because every person she had trusted in the last 4 months had either turned away or turned on her. But Ethan Caldwell sat across from her and listened without interrupting. And there was something about the quality of his silence that was different from the silence of men who are simply waiting for their turn to speak. He was actually hearing her. Her father, James Bennett, had owned 40 acres northeast of Millhaven. Good land. River access on one side, solid grazing ground, a farmhouse he'd built himself board by board. He had worked it for 23 years. And when he died in the spring, a fever that came fast and didn't leave room for goodbyes, Clara had come back from teaching school in Billings to settle his affairs. That was when she found the debt, a debt she had never heard her father mention. $1,700, supposedly borrowed from Harlan Voss's land company, secured against the Bennett property. The paperwork looked official. It had stamps and signatures and dates that seemed to correspond to real events. But it was wrong. She knew it was wrong because she knew her father, and James Bennett had been a man who lived within his means and taught his daughter to do the same. He would not have borrowed $1,700 from a man like Voss without telling her. He would not have signed anything that put his land at risk without telling her. She had gone to the county office and asked to see the original transaction records. The clerk had been polite and had told her they were unavailable. She had gone to the lawyer her father had used for his will. The lawyer had sat behind his desk and told her, carefully, that the debt appeared to be valid and that contesting it would be expensive. And that sometimes, he said this gently, sometimes adult children don't know everything their parents did. She had gone to the sheriff. The sheriff had told her that Harlan Voss was one of the county's largest employers and a man of substantial standing, and that if she had evidence of wrongdoing, she was welcome to file a formal complaint, and he would look into it. And his expression when he said this made very clear that he would not. Clara had done what they didn't expect her to do. She went back to her father's house, and she searched it. She was methodical about it. She was patient about it. She had been raised by a man who believed in keeping records. And she knew how he thought. And she knew where he would hide something he needed to keep safe, but didn't want found by casual eyes. She found it in the false bottom of the chest he kept at the foot of his bed, a set of papers, folded small and wrapped in oilcloth that told a different story entirely. Her father had met with Voss's agent 6 months before his death. Not to borrow money, to report a concern. James Bennett had become aware, through conversations with his neighbors, of a pattern in how Voss's land company operated sudden debts appearing against properties. Documents that families couldn't remember signing. Officials who were unusually helpful to Voss's interests and unusually unhelpful to everyone else's. He had written it down. Names, dates, amounts, the neighbors who had already lost their land, and the ones who were next in line. He had sent a copy to the Territorial Land Office. And then he had gotten sick. And then he had died. And Voss's agent had appeared at the county office to file the debt against the Bennett property 12 days after James Bennett's funeral. Clara looked up from the papers in the oilcloth and understood exactly what had happened to her father, and to his neighbors, and to the land that was supposed to be hers. She had taken the documents and left before dawn. He had 3 of his men watching the house, she told Ethan. I didn't know that until I was already through the tree line. They came after me on horseback. I rode until my horse threw a shoe, and then I ran. She looked down at her boots. I ran for a long time. Ethan had been quiet through all of it. He stood now and poured himself the last of the coffee and stood by the window where the morning light came in at a low angle. This pattern, he said. Sudden debts against properties. How many families? That my father documented specifically. 11. But he wrote that he believed there were more families who had already left, or who didn't know yet what was happening to them. Ethan set his cup down very carefully. What is it? Clara asked. He turned to look at her. 6 months ago, I received a notice from a land office in Billings. A discrepancy in my original deed filing from when I purchased this property 8 years back. Small error in the survey notation. They said it needed to be corrected and I needed to sign updated documents. He paused. I signed them. Clara went very still. Who handled the correction? Agent out of the county land office. Name? He stopped. His name was Gerald Fenner. Gerald Fenner, Clara said, and opened the oilcloth bundle she had not let go of since she'd sat down. She spread the papers carefully on the table. She found the page she was looking for and turned it so he could read it. The name Gerald Fenner appeared twice, once as a witness, once as the notary who had certified the fraudulent debt against the Halsey family's property, which they had lost the following spring. Ethan looked at the paper for a long time. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. Tell me everything again, he said. From the beginning, I want to hear every name. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Clara spread the documents across the kitchen table and Ethan brought out his own ranch records deed papers. The correction notice from Billings. A letter from the county assessor's office that he'd filed away without reading carefully because he'd had 2 sick cattle and a broken irrigation line that week, and the letter had seemed like routine correspondence. It was not routine correspondence. It was, Clara explained. The first stage. The establishment of a paper relationship between the property and Voss's organization. Something small enough not to alarm. Something official-looking enough to create a record. He doesn't rush it, she said, moving papers from one pile to another with the efficient certainty of a woman who understood documents. That's what my father noticed. He's patient. He builds a foundation over months, sometimes over a year, and by the time the debt appears, there's already a paper trail that makes it look like the relationship between the landowner and Voss's company has existed for a long time. And the officials, some of them don't know. He uses real offices, real processes. He files things correctly. The corruption is in what he files, not always in who processes it. She paused. But some of them know. The ones who matter. The ones who can make a complaint disappear. Ethan thought about the sheriff he'd known for 6 years. A man who came to the harvest social every year and drank his coffee without sugar and seemed like a decent human being. How do you know which ones? He asked. You find out when you try to report it. There was a weight in those words that he didn't press on. She pointed to a document near the bottom of her pile. This is the one that matters most. This is what Voss wants back. She paused before she let him look at it. My father had a contact at the Territorial Land Office, someone he trusted. He sent a copy of his findings there. But he also wrote a letter to this person, describing what he'd observed and asking for a private investigation. This is the carbon copy he kept. Ethan looked at the letter. It was written in a careful, even hand a man used to expressing himself precisely. And at the bottom was the name of the territorial contact. He looked up. You know this man? Clara asked, reading his expression. I know of him, Ethan said slowly. He came through this county 2 years ago, doing a survey of land title disputes in the territory. Stayed at the hotel in Millhaven for 2 weeks. People talked about him because he asked questions nobody liked being asked. He set the letter down. He has authority. If he received my father's first letter and has been quietly investigating, then this letter is the link between what your father reported and whoever in the county is working with Voss. Ethan looked at her. With this and your father's documentation, an investigation has something to anchor to. That's why Voss wants it back, Clara said. Not because it proves the fraud by itself, because it tells someone with authority where to look. They looked at each other across the table covered in papers, and the weight of what they were sitting in the middle of settled over both of them. Ethan's ranch was not an accident. She had not brought trouble to his doorstep. The trouble had already found his doorstep before she arrived. His name was Roy Briggs, and he had worked at Broken Creek for 4 years. He was a quiet man, good with horses, reliable, the kind of hand who showed up before you called him and didn't need to be told twice about anything. Ethan had trusted him the way you trust a man who has given you no reason not to. Roy came back from Millhaven with supplies that afternoon and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when he saw Clara at the table. Wasn't expecting company, he said to Ethan rather than to her. Clara's helping with the accounts, Ethan said. Roy's eyes moved across the papers on the table. Not quickly, slowly, with a kind of deliberate casualness that was actually the opposite of casual. Didn't know the accounts needed help. Every set of books benefits from a second pair of eyes, Clara said pleasantly. Roy looked at her then, and Clara looked back at him. And the look that passed between them lasted only a second. But Ethan caught it, the specific quality of two people in the same room who each know something the other one doesn't want exposed. I'll get the supplies unloaded, Roy said and went back outside. Clara waited until she heard his boots on the porch steps. And then she turned to Ethan and kept her voice very low. How long has he worked for you? 4 years. He's been solid. Does he go into Millhaven often? Ethan thought about it. He makes the supply run about twice a month. More frequently than that sometimes when he stopped. When Ethan had paperwork to file. When Ethan had letters to send. When there were things that needed to go to the county office on Ethan's behalf, because Ethan was too busy on the ranch to make the trip himself. Roy Briggs had been handling Ethan's correspondence for 2 years. Every piece of mail that came to Broken Creek passed through Roy's hands first. Ethan didn't say any of this out loud, he didn't have to. Clara could see him, working through it from across the table. Don't let him know you're thinking about it, she said quietly. Not yet. If he's reporting to Voss, then Voss already knows I'm here. If we tip our hand too early, I know, Ethan said. He kept his voice even and his face steady for the rest of the afternoon. And it cost him something, that steadiness, because Roy Briggs brought in the supplies and put them away and made himself useful in the ordinary way he always did. And Ethan watched him move through the familiar spaces of his ranch and felt something he recognized as grief. Not just for the trust that might have been betrayed. For the 4 years of it. That evening, after Roy had gone to the bunkhouse, Ethan and Clara sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and Ethan told her about his wife. He didn't plan to. It wasn't a calculated offering. She asked him, simply and directly, how long he'd been running Broken Creek alone. And the answer required more than a number of years. Her name was Margaret, he said. She came out here with me when we bought this land. She thought frontier life would be an adventure. He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't wrong, it was. She loved it, actually. Loved the space, loved the work, never complained about anything she didn't have to complain about. Another pause. Longer. Fever took her and our daughter both. Winter of '74. 6 days between when they got sick and when they were gone. Clara didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. People always said they were sorry. And he understood why, but it landed wrong every time, because what was there to be sorry about that the words could reach? Instead she said, "How did you stay?" He thought about that. Stayed because leaving would have meant they died for nothing. The land was what we came for. Leaving would have meant walking away from the only thing that still had their names on it. He looked out into the dark where his cattle moved as dim shapes. And then staying just became what I did. You do something long enough, You forget there was a time when you had a choice about it. Clara was quiet for a while. My father stayed too, she said finally. After my mother left, she left. She didn't die, which is its own kind of loss. He stayed on the land, and he made it work, and he made it enough. For both of us. She paused. I always thought he was the strongest person I knew. And then I found those papers, and I understood that he'd been scared. That he'd been trying to get help, and couldn't find any, and he was scared. And he got sick, and she stopped. And he still documented everything, Ethan said. Kept the records. Wrapped them in oilcloth and hid them where he knew you'd look. She was quiet for a long time after that. The stars came out one by one over the Montana sky, and somewhere in the distance an owl made its particular sound. And Broken Creek moved through the darkness with the soft voices of a place that had been worked and lived in for enough years to have its own sounds. We need to get this documentation to the Territorial Land Office, Clara said eventually. Before Voss comes back with proper paper, because I know, and we need to know what Roy told him. How much he knows about what we have. I know that too. And we need to do it without Roy knowing we know. She paused. Do you have anyone else? Someone you trust completely? Ethan thought of his neighbor to the north. A man named Walt Carver who had ranched that ground for 30 years and had a deep, ingrained suspicion of anyone who wore their boots too clean. Maybe one person, he said. Tomorrow. She stood up from the chair and moved toward the door. And then she stopped. Ethan. He looked up at her. What you said today to those men. You didn't know me. You didn't know anything about me. She said this plainly. Not like a question, not like an accusation. No, he agreed. Why? He thought about the bruise on her jaw. He thought about the way she had held his wrist, not begging, not breaking. He thought about the expression on Dolan's face when he looked at her, that dismissive, proprietary look of a man who had already decided what she was worth. Because the man who hit you wasn't there to deliver justice, he said. And I know what justice looks like. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she went inside. Ethan sat alone on the porch for a long time after that, listening to his ranch settle into night, trying to understand why the house behind him no longer felt quite as empty as it had the day before. Roy Briggs left before sunrise. Ethan heard the horse. He lay in his bed, and he heard it, the particular rhythm of a horse being taken out of a stall and saddled quietly. The way a man moves when he doesn't want to wake the house. He had heard Roy take horses out at night before a sick animal. A fence problem in the dark, but this was different. This was careful. This was deliberate. He didn't get up. He lay still and listened until the hoofbeats faded. And then he lay still for another 10 minutes, and then he got up and checked that Clara's door was closed and her window was latched from the inside. He had given her his daughter's room. He hadn't thought about that until this moment. He stood in the hallway outside the door for a moment. And then he went to the kitchen and started the fire for coffee and sat at the table where the documents were still spread. And he thought about what Roy would tell Voss and what Voss would do next. And how long they had. Not long, that was the answer. They didn't have long. Clara came into the kitchen before full light, already dressed and carrying her documents in their oilcloth wrapping. She looked at the 2 cups of coffee on the table. You heard him go, she said. Yes, she sat down and picked up her cup. How far is your neighbor? The one you trust? 3 miles north. Can we get there and back before Voss's men show up? Ethan thought about Dolan's face. The calculation in it. The patience of a man who knew he'd be back. If we go now, he said. Yes. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and drank half of it in one long steady pull. Like a woman fueling herself for what was coming, rather than savoring the taste. Then let's go, she said. Outside, the Montana sky was beginning to turn from black to the deep blue that comes just before the first gray light, and somewhere on the ridge above Broken Creek, the outline of the land was emerging from the dark, the shapes of hills. The distant line of mountains, the space that Ethan Caldwell had stayed on when every reason to stay had left him. He saddled 2 horses. He handed Clara the reins of the steadier one. She took them without comment, mounted without help, and turned the horse north without waiting for instruction. He watched her, for half a second, this woman he had known for less than a day, riding his horse in the early dark with her oilcloth parcel pressed under one arm and her spine straight and her face forward. Then he mounted and followed her, and somewhere 3 miles north, Walt Carver's light was already on in his kitchen window because Walt Carver had always risen before the sun, and because sometimes the thing you need most is already awake when you arrive. Walt Carver opened his door before they reached the porch steps. That was the first thing Ethan noticed, the door swinging open before he'd even raised his hand to knock, which meant Walt had been watching through his window since he heard the horses come up the road. That was Walt. 30 years of frontier living had turned the man into something close to a second sense with legs. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 6 decades arguing with the earth and winning most of the arguments. And he looked at Ethan, and then at Clara, and then at the oilcloth parcel under Clara's arm. And he said, "You'd better come in and tell me how bad it is." "Bad," Ethan said. "Figured." Walt stepped back from the door. "Coffee's on." They sat at Walt's kitchen table, which was older than Ethan's and had the particular scarred surface of a table that had hosted difficult conversations for a very long time. Clara laid the documents out in the order she had established, the ones that showed the pattern first, the ones that named names second, the letter with the territorial contact last, and Walt read them with the slow, careful attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at was not going to make his life easier. When he finished, he didn't say anything for a while. He refilled his coffee. He refilled Clara's. He looked at Ethan. "Gerald Fenner notarized the Halsey papers," Walt said. "You knew the Halseys?" "Knew them. They were good people. Ed Halsey worked that ground for 15 years. Lost it in a week once Voss's men showed up with the debt notice." Walt's jaw tightened. "Ed's in Billings now, working at a livery. 15 years of his life on that land, and now he shovels other men's horses." He tapped the document in front of him. "Fenner was there for that. I watched him ride out with Voss's agent. Thought it was strange at the time." "Strange how?" Clara asked. "Fenner's supposed to be a county official. He's supposed to be neutral. He had no business riding with anyone from Voss's organization." Walt looked at her. "I mentioned it to the sheriff. Sheriff told me to mind my own property." "That's in my father's notes," Clara said. "Sheriff Alderman. He appears 3 times in the pattern." Walt looked at Ethan. "Your man Roy, how long has he been running your correspondence into Millhaven?" 2 years. Walt absorbed this. "So Voss has known about your deed situation for at least that long." "Probably longer." He spread his hands on the table. "Ethan, they were never just going after her father's land and hers. They were always coming for yours too, your river access. Without Broken Creek, the section they're trying to consolidate doesn't connect." Ethan had known this since last night. Hearing Walt say it out loud made it sit differently in his chest, heavier, with sharper edges. "The question," Clara said, "is how we get this documentation to someone who can act on it before Voss closes the legal gap." "The Territorial Land Office," Walt said. "My father sent a copy of his initial findings there to a man named Garrett Cole. That letter she pointed is the copy my father kept. If Cole received it and has been quietly building a case, then what I have here is the piece that completes the picture. But we have to reach Cole before Voss uses whatever warrant he's processing to take these papers back." "Cole's office is in Helena," Walt said. "I know. That's a 2-day ride." "I know that too." Walt looked at Ethan again. There was a conversation happening between the 2 men that didn't need words, the kind that develops between neighbors who have respected each other across a shared fence line for years. "I'll go," Walt said. Clara looked up. "You don't have to. I'm 61 years old and I've been waiting 20 years for a reason to make someone like Harland Voss answer for something." Walt picked up his coffee cup. "Consider this my reason. I can ride hard. I know people on the route who'll give me a fresh horse if I need one." He looked at the documents. "I'll need a copy of the key papers. Everything with Fenner's name. Everything with Alderman's name. And that letter." Clara's expression did something complicated, relief and resistance at war with each other. because she had been carrying this alone for so long that accepting help felt like handing over something vital and hoping the other person didn't drop it. If anything happens to those documents, she started. Nothing will happen to them, Walt said simply. I've kept my cattle through 3 hard winters and 1 flood. I think I can manage paper. Despite everything, despite the fear pressing against the inside of her ribs. Clara almost smiled. Give me 10 minutes, she said, and began making careful copies of the most critical pages. She wrote quickly and precisely, her handwriting as clear as her father's but faster. More urgent, and Ethan watched her hands move across the paper and thought about how James Bennett had taught his daughter to document things properly. Had taught her to be precise and methodical, had given her, without knowing it, the exact tools she would need to fight the battle he'd started and couldn't finish. Walt took the copies, folded them inside a letter of his own, a sworn statement from a neighboring landowner regarding what he had witnessed with the Halsey property, and packed them in his saddlebag. I'll send word when I reach Helena, he said. He looked at Ethan. Keep the originals off the property if you can. If Voss comes with a warrant and searches the house, I'll think of something, Ethan said. Walt put his hand on Ethan's shoulder for one moment. Then he was gone. They heard his horse take the north road at a pace that said the rider on its back intended to cover serious ground before the sun got high. Ethan and Clara looked at each other across the table that still held James Bennett's papers. He didn't ask for anything, Clara said quietly. No. He wouldn't. Why? Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly. Because Walt Carver watched Ed Halsey lose his land and felt sick about it for years and never had a way to do anything. Now he does. He began gathering the documents. Some people don't need a reason to help beyond being shown where the injustice is. Clara was quiet. Then she said, My father would have liked him. They rode back to Broken Creek in the growing morning light and walked into a kitchen that was exactly as they'd left it, except that it wasn't. Because Roy Briggs was sitting at the table. He had come back. He was holding a cup of coffee like he'd made himself right at home. And he looked up at them when they came in with the kind of expression that was trying hard to be ordinary and landing somewhere adjacent to it. Rode out early to check the north fence line, Royce said. Thought I heard something in the night. Everything looks fine. His eyes went to the oilcloth parcel under Clara's arm, and then came back to Ethan's face. You two are up early. Supplies we forgot yesterday, Ethan said. Figured we'd get them from Carver before the day got going. Roy looked at him for one beat too long. Right, Roy said. Good thinking. He finished his coffee and went out to start his morning chores. And Ethan stood in his kitchen and watched him go and felt the particular, exhausting weight of knowing something he couldn't yet prove and couldn't yet use. Clara set the oilcloth parcel on the table. He knows we went north, she said. Yes. He's going to report back to Voss. Probably already did. Before he came back, Ethan turned from the window. We need to move the documents. Where? He thought for a moment. There was a place not on the house property, not in any of the outbuildings that a warrant search would cover. A place his wife had loved out past the east pasture, where a stand of cottonwoods grew along the creek bank. She had kept a waterproof box there, buried shallow, for the small things she wanted to keep that were too precious for a house that burned. He had not opened it since she died. He had not been able to. I know a place, he said. Come with me. They went out through the east pasture, moving at the pace of people, going about ordinary business in case Roy was watching. And they crossed to the creek and into the cottonwoods. And Ethan found the spot by memory because his feet still knew where to go, even when the rest of him had been trying not to think about it. He dug up the box with his hands. It was still sealed tight. The things inside it, a hair ribbon, a small photograph, 2 letters written in his wife's hand, were exactly as she had left them. He held the box for a moment, and Clara stood behind him and said nothing, which was exactly right. Then he carefully moved Margaret's things to one side and wrapped the oilcloth parcel in an additional layer of canvas from his pocket and placed it inside and sealed the lid and buried it again. He smoothed the ground over it and stood up. She kept this here, Clara said. It wasn't a question. She said a house could burn, but the creek would stay. He looked at the ground. She was right about most things. They went back to the ranch. And the morning opened up around them, and Ethan went about his work with the practiced surface of a man whose day was completely normal. And Clara helped with the accounts, the real accounts. His actual records, and somewhere underneath all of that ordinary motion, they were both waiting. The waiting was its own kind of wait. Roy watched them. Ethan could feel it, the particular quality of attention from a person who is monitoring you while pretending not to be. He had known cattle that paid attention this way when they sensed something coming. The sideways awareness of an animal that knows the season is changing. At noon, Clara came to find him at the water trough, the same trough where all of this had started. Not yet 24 hours ago, though it felt like days had passed. He went into the barn, she said. He's been in there for 20 minutes. Ethan set down the coupling. The barn has a loose board on the south wall. Behind it there's a hollow in the post. He paused. Last month I found a folded piece of paper in there. I thought the wind had pushed it through the gap. I threw it away. Clara stared at him. That was a message drop. Yes. So Voss has been communicating with him directly. In writing. She thought quickly. Is there anything there now? Ethan looked at the barn. One way to find out, he said. But they didn't go immediately. They waited. They gave Roy time to finish whatever he was doing. They heard him come out of the barn and go toward the bunkhouse. And they waited another 10 minutes, and then Ethan went to the barn alone. Because two people going together would register differently than one man doing an ordinary inspection of his own outbuilding. He found it, a folded piece of paper pushed into the hollow behind the loose board on the south wall. He read it standing in the dim interior of his barn. And what it said made his jaw set so hard his back teeth ached. It was instructions, not from Roy to Voss but from Voss to Roy. Which meant Voss already knew about Clara, already knew she was at Broken Creek, already knew about the documents. And the instructions were specific. Confirm the location of the papers, confirm how many people knew, and determine whether Ethan Caldwell was a problem that needed managing or just a nuisance that would fold when properly pressured. At the bottom of the instructions, in a different hand, Roy's, were 4 words written as a response, either to be retrieved or to document the exchange. The 4 words were, "She has everything, Caldwell knows." Ethan folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He came out of the barn and walked at a normal pace back to the house, and went into the kitchen and set the paper on the table in front of Clara. She read it. Her face went through several things in quick succession: recognition, calculation, and then a cold, focused anger that was very different from fear. He told them before he came back this morning, she said. Yes. So Voss has known since early this morning that you know. That means he's not waiting for a warrant to be processed. She looked up. He's coming today. Ethan had arrived at the same conclusion while walking back from the barn. Then we need to be ready, he said. How many men can you reach before they get here? It was a fair question and a hard one. Broken Creek was not isolated, but the neighbors who mattered, the ones he trusted, the way he trusted Walt, were scattered across ground that took time to cover. Walt was already gone north. The nearest family was the Templetons, a mile and a half east, but Hal Templeton was 68 and would come with a rifle and a willingness that his body could no longer back up the way his heart intended. 1 or 2, Ethan said honestly. Maybe 3 if the Brewster boys are home. That's not enough to fight them off if Voss comes with armed men. No. But it might be enough to make it matter. Clara looked at him, trying to understand what he meant. If Voss takes those documents by force, Ethan said, he has to do it in front of witnesses, in front of men who can testify to what happened. He's been careful for years, everything through official channels. Everything with paper, everything structured, so it looks legitimate. If he rides into my property and takes something by force in front of witnesses, that's a different kind of exposure. That's the kind of thing that reaches Helena without needing Walt to carry it. He picked up the note Roy had written. And with this, we can also prove that he was using a man on my payroll to spy on me. That's not legal leverage. That's personal. That's something people understand. Clara studied him. You've been thinking about this all morning. Since about 3 in the morning. Actually. She was quiet for a moment. Then what do you need me to do? Go to the Templetons. Tell Hal what's happening. Don't sugarcoat it. Hal respects honesty more than comfort. Ask him to come and bring anyone he can reach. Can you ride that route alone? I can ride any route you point me toward, he almost said. I know. He almost said it with something in his voice that would have meant more than the words. He kept it even. East Pasture Gate, follow the fence line. The road turns northeast. White House, Red Barn, you can't miss it. He met her eyes. And Clara, keep your head down on the road. If you see Dolan or any of Voss's men before you reach the Templetons, you don't stop. You cut across country and you keep going. And you? I'm going to have a conversation with Roy Briggs. Clara looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them had language, for yet the recognition of two people who have moved in a very short time from strangers to something neither of them has a clean word for. Be careful, she said. You too. She took the horse and went east. He waited until she was clear of the property, and then he walked to the bunkhouse. Roy Briggs was sitting on his bunk cleaning a bridle, which was the kind of ordinary activity a man engages in when he's waiting for something and doesn't want to appear to be waiting. He looked up when Ethan came in, and his expression settled into the careful neutrality of a person who has been running a double life for long enough that neutral is easy. Roy, Ethan said. Boss. Ethan took the folded paper out of his pocket and set it on the end of the bunk. Roy looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without picking it up, like a man hoping that if he doesn't touch something, it will stop being real. Then he let out a long, slow breath and set the bridle down. How long have you known? He asked. Long enough. Ethan sat on the stool by the wall. Tell me why. Roy rubbed the back of his neck. He had the look of a man working out which version of the truth was survivable. Voss's people came to me 14 months ago. Told me they needed someone at Broken Creek. Told me it was just information not to hurt anyone. Just to keep them informed. Deed records, correspondence. What you were filing and where. He looked at his hands. They paid good. I always need the money. Roy had said flatly, without self-pity, I'm a 53-year-old ranch hand. Ethan, I've got nothing put away. I've got no land, no family, and in 5 years my back won't hold up for this work, and I'll have nothing to fall back on. They offered me enough to change that. Ethan looked at him. He looked at the man he had trusted for 4 years and tried to hold both things at once, the betrayal and the desperation. They were not the same thing. They were not mutually exclusive. What did you tell them this morning? Ethan asked. Everything I knew. Roy met his eyes, and there was something in his face now that wasn't calculation, it was shame. The particular shame of a man who has done something he can't fully justify even to himself. That she had documents. That you knew. That you went to Carver's place. Do they know what Walt is doing with what we gave him? Roy hesitated. I don't know what he's doing. I just said you rode north. Ethan absorbed this. Walt had a head start, and Roy didn't know his destination. That was something. Here's what's going to happen, Ethan said. Voss is coming today. Probably with enough men to make it look official. And probably with whatever warrant Dolan said was being processed. When they get here, you're going to make a choice. You can be a man who helped them take something from someone who didn't deserve to lose it. Or you can be a man who told the truth when it mattered. Roy stared at him. You're asking me to turn against them. I'm asking you to stop turning against me. The silence in the bunkhouse stretched out. Outside, the ranch made its ordinary sounds: cattle, wind, the creak of the weather vane above the main barn. They'll come after me, Roy said. Probably. And you're asking me to do it anyway. I'm asking you what kind of man you want to be when this is over, Ethan said. That's all. Roy picked up the bridle again. He held it without doing anything with it. He stared at the floor of the bunkhouse for a long time. Then he set it down again and stood up. What do you need me to do? He said. Ethan told him. They had less than 3 hours, judging by when Voss's people would have received Roy's morning report and organized their response. 3 hours was not a lot of time, it was also not nothing. Ethan had built fences in 3 hours. He had pulled cattle from mud in 3 hours. He had done things in 3 hours that required precision and speed and the willingness to work past the point where your body was telling you to stop. He started with the most critical thing. He wrote a letter. It was addressed to Garrett Cole at the Territorial Land Office in Helena, and it was written in the specific, detailed language of a man who understood land records and legal process, because Ethan Caldwell had bought and filed his own deed and had fought his own small legal battle with a survey dispute in the second year of ownership. And he knew the vocabulary. He described what Clara had found, what his own records showed, what Walt Carver had witnessed with the Halsey property, and what Roy Briggs had confirmed about the surveillance operation run from Broken Creek. He signed it with his full name. He sealed it. He gave it to Roy Briggs with instructions that if anything happened at the ranch today that prevented Ethan from sending it himself, Roy was to ride to Millhaven and send it by the fastest available wire to Helena. Not the county sheriff's office, not any local official. Directly to the Territorial Land Office. Roy took the letter and put it inside his vest. If I do, Roy, and it goes wrong, if it goes wrong, you're no worse off than you were before, Ethan said. You're already in it, Roy. The question is which side you're standing on when it comes out. Roy nodded once. The nod of a man who has run out of alternatives and discovered that having no choice is, in its own terrible way, a kind of relief. Clara came back from the Templetons in just under an hour. She came back with Hal Templeton, who was indeed 68 and carried a rifle that had been oiled carefully despite his trembling hands, and with Hal's son-in-law, Thomas, who was 32 and large in a way that suggested he had never lost an argument with manual labor, and with a neighbor named Cassidy, whose first name Clara had not caught, but who had the focused expression of a woman who had heard the name Harlan Voss before and reacted to it the way people react to a word for something they have long known to be true. They gathered in Ethan's kitchen, which had become, in the space of less than 24 hours, a kind of command room for something none of them had been planning to be part of yesterday. Clara laid out what they knew, quickly and clearly, without embellishment. She had a talent for stripping things down to the essential sequence of facts, presenting them in the order that made the pattern undeniable. Ethan watched the faces around his kitchen table as she spoke, watched Hal's jaw get tight, watched Thomas's hands flatten on the table surface, watched the woman named Cassidy's eyes go still in the particular way of someone connecting something new to something they had always suspected. When Clara finished, Hal looked at Ethan. They're coming today, yes. And you've got a man who can testify they were running a spy operation out of your bunkhouse. Yes. And the documents themselves are off the property. Yes. Hal considered this arrangement with the expression of a chess player seeing 3 moves ahead. So if they come with a warrant to search for the documents, they won't find anything. And if they try to take the woman, they'll be doing it in front of witnesses, Ethan said. Which is exactly the kind of thing that can't be explained away with paper. Hal put his rifle across his knees. That's smart. It's Clara's thinking, Ethan said. Clara didn't look up from the papers she was organizing, but her shoulders changed a barely perceptible shift that was something like being seen. They took up positions that were not positions. They were people going about ordinary life on a ranch, except that they were distributed at angles that covered every approach to the house, and every person there had a clear line of sight to every other, and nobody had their back to a road. Ethan stood on the porch. He was not going to stand inside his own house waiting for Harlan Voss's men to knock on his door. He was going to stand on his porch in the Montana sun and let them come to him. Roy Briggs stood near the barn, which put him between the house and the north road. He was not holding anything. He was not threatening anyone. He was simply present, and the specifics of his presence had shifted. He was no longer a man monitoring the situation for someone else's benefit. He was watching it for his own. Clara stood just inside the front door, in the shadow of the frame, where she could see and not be immediately seen. The first sound was hoofbeats, a lot of them. Ethan counted by sound before he counted by sight 6 horses. Maybe 8. Coming down the main road with no particular effort at concealment. Because men who are certain of their authority don't hide their approach. They arrive. He stood on his porch and he put his hands in his pockets. Which was a deliberate choice, not reaching for anything. Not posturing, just a man standing on his own land with his hands in his pockets. Waiting. And then Dolan came through the gate at the head of 7 mounted men. And behind the mounted men came a wagon driven by a man in town clothes, who had the specific humorless expression of a county official who is performing a function he would like to complete quickly and without incident. And behind the wagon, riding a dark horse, and dressed with the careful neatness of a man who understands that power is performed as much as it is held, came a man that Ethan had never met but recognized immediately. Harland Voss, not sending proxies this time. Coming himself, Ethan looked at him and understood something. Voss had decided that Broken Creek was important enough to attend to, personally. Which meant this was not about the documents anymore. Or not only about the documents. This was about making something clear about establishing, in front of anyone watching, exactly where the weight of power in this county sat. Voss pulled his horse to a stop, 10 feet from the porch steps, and looked down at Ethan Caldwell with the evaluating patience of a man who expects the next few minutes to go exactly the way he has planned them. "Mr. Caldwell," Voss said, "we've come for the documents and the woman. I'd prefer to do this without complication." Ethan looked up at him. "I know what you'd prefer," he said. "Tell me what you're authorized to take." Voss's expression shifted just slightly. Just enough. He had expected more resistance or less. He had not expected precision. From inside the doorway, Clara spoke. Her voice was clear and it carried, and it was the voice of a woman who had run from these men yesterday and was not running today. "Mr. Voss," she said, "before you speak about authorization, you should know that there are 4 witnesses on this property who will testify to everything said and done in the next 10 minutes. And you should know that copies of my father's documentation, along with a sworn statement from a neighboring landowner and a signed letter from the owner of this ranch, are already on their way to the Territorial Land Office in Helena." She paused. To Garrett Cole specifically, the name landed. Ethan saw it land on Voss's face, the very slight reorganization of features that happens when a man who has spent years being several steps ahead of everyone suddenly realizes he is not several steps ahead of this. Dolan's horse shifted under him. The wagon driver looked at the ground. Voss's expression settled back into control, but it had taken a half-second too long. And everyone on that porch had seen it. "Whatever she told you," Voss said. And his voice was still measured. Still the voice of a man accustomed to being the authority in any room he entered. "She is a thief and a fugitive. You are harboring a criminal and interfering with lawful." "Show me the warrant," Ethan said. The county official in the wagon produced a paper and climbed down and walked it to the porch steps. Ethan took it. He read it carefully, because he had learned from Clara how to read documents carefully. He read every word. Then he looked up. "This warrant authorizes a search of the Broken Creek Ranch property for documents alleged to have been stolen from the office of Harland Voss on or around June the 14th. He looked at Voss. "You're welcome to search. You won't find them here." Voss stared at him. "And the warrant doesn't name her." Ethan handed the paper back to the official. "There's no warrant for the arrest of any individual on this property. If you have one, produce it. If you don't, then the only thing this warrant authorizes is a search of my buildings." He spread his hands. "Go ahead." From his position near the barn, Roy Briggs said clearly, in a voice that everyone on the property could hear, "I can tell you there are no stolen documents in any of these outbuildings. I work here. I've looked." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a situation that has shifted beyond the point where force is the clean solution it was supposed to be. Harland Voss sat on his horse and looked at Ethan Caldwell standing on his porch with witnesses around him and a woman in the doorway who knew his name and could say it to Garrett Cole. And he recalculated. He was good at recalculating. He had survived in this business by being good at it. "We'll conduct the search," he said finally, and his voice had lost some of the easy authority it had arrived with. "Take your time," Ethan said. They searched for the better part of an hour. They were thorough. Ethan had to give them that. They went through the house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the storage shed, the root cellar. They lifted floorboards and checked under mattresses and opened every drawer and cabinet. They found nothing, because what they were looking for was buried in a waterproof box beside a creek, in a hollow that had been dug by a woman who understood that a house could, but the creek would stay. When Dolan came back out of the house and looked at Voss, the look between them contained an entire argument conducted in silence. Voss's face was a wall, but behind the wall something was moving, and it was the specific movement of a plan meeting resistance it hadn't fully accounted for. Voss turned his horse. He didn't look at Ethan again. He didn't look at Clara, who had stepped out onto the porch now, and stood with her arms at her sides and her chin level. He looked for just a moment at Roy Briggs, and Roy Briggs looked back at him. That look lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, every calculation Voss had been making about the reliability of his asset inside Broken Creek updated itself, and the update was not favorable. Then Voss rode out. His men followed, the wagon followed, and Dolan, last through the gate, paused and turned in his saddle and looked back at the porch. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look said, "This isn't finished." Ethan looked back at him and let the look say, "I know." Then Dolan was gone, and the road was empty, and the sounds of the ranch came back in cattle. Wind, the creak of the weather vane, and Hal Templeton let out a long breath from where he'd been standing near the east wall. And Thomas unclenched his very large hands, and the woman named Cassidy said, quietly and with great feeling, while Clara sat down on the porch step. Not from weakness, from the release of something she had been holding at absolute tension for the last 2 hours. And sitting down was the only reasonable response to that release. Ethan sat down beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. "They'll go after Walt," she said finally. "If they figure out where he's going." "Yes, can he move fast enough?" "Walt Carver has been moving fast his entire life. He'll be fine." She nodded, but it was the nod of someone who needs to believe something more than they fully believe it. Ethan looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the bruise yellowing along it, the way she held herself even when sitting down on a porch step after the longest morning of either of their lives. "You named Cole," he said, in front of Voss. "You named him." I needed Voss to understand the scope of what he was facing. She looked down at her hands. "It was a risk. If Cole hasn't done anything with my father's letter," then naming him just told Voss who to pressure next. "And if Cole has been doing something quietly all this time." She looked out toward the road where the dust of Voss's departure was still settling. "Then we just told Voss that the quiet is over," she said. Ethan considered this. He thought about the letter his wife had written, the 2 letters in the waterproof box, in her careful hand, that he had not been able to read since she died. He thought about how she used to say that the hardest part of any fight was not the fighting, but the waiting after, when you didn't know yet which way things were going to fall. He thought she would have liked Clara Bennett. He thought she would have had something specific and accurate to say about this situation. And he found himself wishing he could hear it. "We hold what we have," Clara said. "Walt gets to Helena. Cole receives the copies. The letter you wrote corroborates everything." She turned to look at him, and her expression had the quality of someone who has been running on nothing but adrenaline and willpower and is beginning to take stock of what else is actually there. "We did everything we could today." "Yes," Ethan said. "That has to be enough for now." He looked at her. "It's enough," he said. Around them, Hal and Thomas and the woman named Cassidy were talking in low voices, the particular tone of people processing something they've been part of and are still understanding the full shape of. Roy Briggs had not come to the porch. He was standing near the barn alone, holding Ethan's letter inside his vest, looking at the road where Voss's men had gone. He had made his choice. Whether it would cost him everything or save him was a question that didn't have an answer yet. There were a lot of questions that didn't have answers yet. But the documents were safe. Walt was riding. Cole had a name attached to the evidence now, and Harlan Voss had come to Broken Creek Ranch with 8 men and a warrant, and had left with nothing, and he had left with witnesses watching him leave. That was what they had. It wasn't everything, but it was the kind of thing that, in Ethan's experience, was enough to keep fighting from. The afternoon opened around them, and Broken Creek Ranch settled back into its sounds. And somewhere under a stand of cottonwoods, by the water that would outlast every human plan made along its banks, a waterproof box held the evidence of everything that still needed to be answered for. The dust from Voss's departure had barely settled when Clara went back inside and began making a list. Ethan watched her do it. She sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and wrote in the same careful, fast hand she used for everything, names on the left side, known connections in the middle, unknown variables on the right. It was the list of a woman who had survived the last 4 months by refusing to let fear substitute for thinking. And seeing it made something in Ethan's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Hal Templeton stayed for another hour, drinking coffee and offering his opinion on Harlan Voss's character in terms that were specific and unflattering and probably accurate. Thomas stayed with him, quiet and useful in the way of large men who understand that their presence is itself a contribution. The woman named Cassidy, her full name turned out to be Ellen Cassidy, widow, 44, who ran a small cattle operation 6 miles south with her 2 adult sons, sat across from Clara and listened to everything and said very little until she said something that mattered. "My husband filed a complaint against Voss's land company 3 years ago," Ellen said. "A discrepancy in a survey line that shifted our eastern boundary 40 feet in Voss's favor. The county surveyor sided with Voss. My husband appealed to the territorial office." She paused. "He died 6 months later. Heart, they said." The kitchen went quiet. Clara looked up from her list. "Did you keep the complaint documents?" Clara asked. Ellen looked at her steadily. "I kept everything my husband ever touched. I need to see them. I'll bring them tomorrow morning." Clara wrote Ellen Cassidy's name at the top of the left column and drew a line under it. Ethan thought about James Bennett, who had also filed with the territorial office, who had also documented everything, who had also died of something that came fast and didn't leave room for goodbyes. He thought about this pattern in the specific way that a man who has grown up on frontier land thinks about patterns, not with paranoia, but with the cold, practical recognition that when the same sequence of events produces the same result more than twice, it is not coincidence. He thought about his own signature on the deed correction documents that Gerald Fenner had brought him 18 months ago. He thought about what he had signed after Hal and Thomas and Ellen left, after the ranch settled back into its afternoon rhythms with Roy Briggs, moving through his chores with the particular care of a man trying to prove something through his work. Ethan sat down across from Clara and said what he had been thinking about since the moment Voss rode away. "If Fenner filed false corrections to my deed," he said, "I may not legally own this land anymore." Clara set her pen down. "That's what I've been working through," she said. "Walk me through it." She turned the paper so he could see it. She had diagrammed the pattern his situation fit the stages Voss used, each one building on the last, each one creating a paper foundation for what came next. The deed correction was stage 2 in a 4-stage process. Stage 3 was a manufactured default. Stage 4 was acquisition. You signed corrected deed documents 18 months ago. Those documents were prepared by Fenner, who is documented in my father's papers as working for Voss. Depending on what those corrections actually changed, and I haven't seen them, I'm working from your description. It's possible that you signed away specific protections that were in your original deed. What kind of protections? Dispute resolution clauses, appeal rights, water access notation. She held his gaze. The kind of language that makes the difference between a deed that can be challenged and one that can't. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then sliced up and went to the chest in the front room where he kept his important papers, his original deed, the survey records, his cattle registration documents, the letter from the county assessor's office that he'd set aside without reading carefully. He brought them all back to the table and spread them out. Clara went through them with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. She read slowly. She compared sections between the original deed and the corrected version side by side. She made marks in the margin of her notes. She asked him twice to clarify what he remembered about specific conversations with Fenner during the signing. After 30 minutes, she sat back. "It's the water excess clause," she said. "Your original deed specified riparian rights to the creek on your eastern boundary unrestricted access. Part of the original purchase. The corrected version removed the word unrestricted and added a qualifier that ties your access rights to a separate operating agreement." She found the page. An operating agreement with a company called Millhaven Land and Resource Partners. Ethan stared at the page. "I've never heard of that company." "You wouldn't have. It's one of Voss's subsidiary organizations. It appears twice in my father's documents under different contexts. It's how he structures the debt. He doesn't create the debt directly under his own name. He creates it through a subsidiary, so when the debt appears, it looks like a business obligation rather than a personal predatory loan." Clara tapped the page. "This operating agreement, do you have a copy of it? Fenner told me it would be filed with the county and that I'd receive a copy within 30 days. He looked at her. "I never received it, because it was never meant for you to see." She folded her hands on the table. "Ethan, the operating agreement almost certainly contains default terms. Terms you've already technically violated, because you never even knew you were a party to the agreement." She paused to let that land fully. "Voss doesn't need to manufacture a debt against your property. He's already manufactured a default on an agreement you didn't know existed. The enormity of this sat between them like something with physical weight." Ethan had worked Broken Creek for 8 years. He had built every fence, dug every post, improved every structure. He had kept this land through drought and bad seasons and the long silence after Margaret died, because this land was the last place that had her name on it. And 18 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon, when he had 2 sick cattle and a broken irrigation line, he had sat across a desk from Gerald Fenner and signed documents that he had not read closely enough. Because Fenner was a county official and the matter seemed routine. And he had been tired. He had been tired, and he had trusted the wrong person, and now someone else might own his water. Clara watched him process this. She didn't try to rush him through it or soften the edges of what she'd told him. She let him sit with it, which was exactly what he needed, not comfort, but space to absorb the truth and decide what to do with it. "How do we fight it?" he asked. "The same way we fight the rest of it," she said. "We prove Fenner's connection to Voss. We prove the subsidiary company is a fraudulent construct. And we prove that the operating agreement was filed deceptively without your full informed consent." She leaned forward. "What I have in my father's documents shows the pattern. What Ellen Cassidy has adds a second data point. What you have, your original deed, the corrected version, and the county assessor's letter is the evidence of how it was applied to Broken Creek specifically." She looked at him steadily. "Together, it's a case. A real one. If Cole receives what Walt is carrying, it becomes a territorial matter, not a county one. Voss can't contain a territorial investigation the way he can contain a local complaint." She picked up her pen. "But we need to be faster than his next move. Today didn't stop him. It slowed him down and showed him we're not alone. But Voss has been doing this for years. He's resourceful. What's his next move? He'll try to isolate us," she said. "Cut off support. Go after the people who helped us today." Ethan thought about Hal Templeton, 68 years old, sitting on land he'd worked for 30 years. He thought about Ellen Cassidy, running her operation alone with 2 sons, since her husband died of a heart that may not have failed entirely on its own. "He'll start with the most vulnerable," Ethan said. "He always does." Ethan stood up. "Then we warned them tonight. He sent Roy because Roy knew every road in this county. Because Roy needed something to do that cost him something. Because giving a man who has made a wrong choice the chance to make a right one is sometimes the only currency that actually purchases change. Roy rode out with a message for Hal Templeton and Ellen Cassidy and the Brewster brothers to be careful, to keep their own records secured, To trust no one from the county office without verification. While Roy was gone, Ethan and Clara worked through the evening. She organized everything into a coherent presentation, the kind that Garrett Cole could look at and understand in 30 minutes what had taken her 4 months to piece together. She was good at this. Ethan kept finding himself watching her work, and then catching himself watching her work, and looking back at his own papers with the slightly off-balance feeling of a man who has just noticed something has changed in his internal geography. She caught him at it once. She didn't make a thing of it. She just said, without looking up, "You should eat something. You've been running on nothing since before sunrise." He went and made food, actual food. The first full meal either of them had eaten all day, and they ate at the table, with the papers pushed to one side. And for a little while the kitchen was just a kitchen, and 2 people sitting in it, after a long and exhausting day. "What was her name?" Clara asked. "Your daughter." He looked up. "Grace," he said. Clara nodded. She didn't say anything else for a moment. "How old was she?" 4. He set his fork down. She knew all the horses by name. Every one of them. Talked to them like they were people she was catching up with. Clara smiled, a real one. Small and private, the kind that appears when something touches a true place. "My father used to talk to his mules," she said. Full conversations. He maintained they were better listeners than most people. He wasn't wrong. They looked at each other across the table. And the weight of the day was still there, the documents. The visit from Voss, the things at stake that neither of them could fully set down. But alongside the weight was something else, something quieter. The particular ease of 2 people who have been through something together and come out the other side still talking. It didn't last long. It wasn't supposed to. Roy came back with confirmation that his messages had been delivered. And Clara went back to her organizing, and Ethan went to check the north fence, because he needed to move his body and think. And the evening moved toward night. Roy came to find Ethan at the fence. He stood on the other side of the post line and said, "Dolan came by the Templeton place while I was there." Ethan turned. "He didn't do anything," Roy said quickly. "Just rode up. Looked around, spoke to Hal at the gate. Told him that harboring a fugitive and interfering with a lawful investigation were serious matters, and that the county took them seriously." Roy's expression was flat. Hal told him that he'd lived in this county for 30 years, and if the county had a concern, it was welcome to put it in writing and deliver it through proper channels. And then he closed the gate. Ethan released a breath. "Did Dolan see you?" "No, I was in the barn." But Ethan, Roy hesitated. He had 4 men with him. He didn't need 4 men to deliver a message to a 68-year-old man. "No," Ethan agreed. He didn't. He was making a point, showing Hal what 4 men looked like in his yard. Roy looked at his hands. Voss doesn't intimidate with words. He intimidates with presence. With making you aware of how many people he has and how few you have. Ethan looked at Roy. "You've watched him work. 14 months. Roy met his eyes without flinching. "I watched him take apart 3 families from a distance. I told myself I was just providing information, not participating. I told myself what happened to those families was going to happen, with or without me." He paused. "I know that's not true." "What changed?" Ethan asked. Not to challenge him, genuinely wanting to know. Roy was quiet for a long moment. "She ran," he said. "That woman. I was in the bunkhouse that morning when she came through your fence line, and I watched from the window. And she wasn't running the way guilty people run, panicked and directionless. She was running toward something. Like she knew exactly where she needed to get to, even though she'd never been here." He looked in the direction of the house. "Something about that. It stayed with me." Ethan thought about the same moment. The way her fingers had locked around his wrist. Not begging. Not breaking. He didn't say anything. Roy went back to the bunkhouse and Ethan came inside and found Clara at the table. But she wasn't working anymore. She was sitting very still with a piece of paper in her hands that wasn't one of her father's documents. He recognized the handwriting before she spoke. It was her father's hand. But it was different from the legal documents, looser. More personal. A letter, not a record. "I found this tucked inside the oilcloth," she said. "It was separate from the rest. I hadn't opened that layer before. She looked at the paper. He wrote it after he got sick. After he knew he wasn't going to get better. She paused. He wrote it to me. Ethan sat down. She read part of it aloud. Not all of it, the part she needed to say out loud to make it fully real. Her father had written that he was sorry he couldn't finish it. That he had tried to find the right people and the right channels, and he had not moved fast enough. That he was leaving her the records because they were the only weapon he had. And because she was the only person he trusted to use them correctly. He wrote that she was the strongest person he had ever known. And that she had gotten that from her mother and from herself. Not from him, but that he had tried every day to be worthy of being her father. He wrote that the land was not what mattered. He wrote that what mattered was that she understood she had the right to fight and the capacity to win, and that those two things together were enough for anything. He wrote, "Don't run toward danger, Clara. Don't run away from the truth either. Walk toward it straight. That's what Bennett women do." Clara set the letter down. She didn't cry. She had, Ethan suspected, cried already, probably in the days after she found the oilcloth. Probably in some moment she'd kept entirely to herself, because there was no one enough to be that vulnerable in front of. He knew, she said, yes. He knew he wasn't going to be there for this part. She looked at the letter. And he trusted me to do it anyway. Ethan didn't say she was sorry. He didn't say everything would be fine. He said what seemed true. He was right about you, he said. For what that's worth. She looked at him. Then she carefully refolded the letter and placed it back inside the oilcloth. Separate from the legal documents, her father's last words to her, carried in the same bundle as his evidence, because in the end there was no clean dividing line between James Bennett the fighter and James Bennett the father. They were the same man, just as she was in every way that mattered. His daughter. The night passed without incident, which Ethan distrusted more than he would have trusted an incident. Quiet from Voss's direction meant thinking, and a man who had built the operation Voss had built was dangerous when he was thinking. Morning brought two things simultaneously. The first was Ellen Cassidy, arriving earlier than she'd promised, with a locked box of her husband's documents, that she carried with both arms and set on the table with the particular care of someone handling something irreplaceable. The second was a rider Ethan didn't recognize, coming fast from the south on a horse that had been pushed hard, pulling up at the gate and calling out before he'd even dismounted. Ethan went to the gate, and the rider, young, maybe 20, with the dust of a long night's travel on him, reached inside his coat and produced a folded note and said, "From a man named Carver. Said you'd know who." Ethan's heart moved. He opened the note. Walt's handwriting was large and uneven from writing on horseback, but legible. Reached Helena. "Cole received your father's letter and has been building quietly for 8 months. Not alone, he has 2 others from the land office working with him. They wanted documentation. I gave them what Clara prepared. Cole says he can move within the week if the originals are produced. He needs someone to bring them in person, cannot trust the mail for originals of this value. Cole also says do not let Voss get those papers, he knows they exist. Cole has been aware of Voss for longer than we knew, and Voss has contacts inside the territorial office. Not Cole, not his 2 colleagues, but others. Be careful who you speak to. I am staying in Helena until this resolves. Come when you can." Ethan read the note twice. He gave the rider water and money for a fresh horse and sent him on his way. Then he went inside and gave the note to Clara. She read it standing up. When she finished, she set it on the table and stood very still for a moment. "Cole has contacts inside the territorial office," she said. "That means Voss will know Walt reached Helena. He'll know the copies were delivered." "Yes." "Which means Voss knows the investigation is moving." She looked up. "He's going to come back here for the originals. Not through official channels this time. He has no more legitimate paper to play. If he wants those documents before Cole acts, he has to take them. He'll send men tonight," Ethan said. "Or he'll come himself." The specific quality of this moment, the understanding of how close they were to the edge of something, and how little room there was between where they stood and where things could go irreparably wrong, registered on both of them at the same time. Clara turned to Ellen Cassidy, who had been listening from across the table with the stillness of a woman who had been waiting a long time to be useful. "Mrs. Cassidy, your husband's documents. Are there records of the survey dispute in here?" "Anything dated and witnessed." "Everything dated," Ellen said. "My husband was meticulous." "Good. I need to photograph the key pages, copy them exactly, word for word, in the next 2 hours." She looked at Ethan. "And I need to go get the originals from the creek." "I'll go with you." "No. You stay visible here. If Voss or Dolan rides by, and the property looks occupied and normal, that buys us time." She held his gaze. "I know where the box is. I buried it." He wanted to argue. The argument that was available to him was that it was dangerous to send her alone. And she would respond that she had been alone through all of this for 4 months, and she was still standing. And both things would be true, and she would go anyway. "Take the bay," he said. "She's steadier if something startles her." Clara nodded and went. He stood at the window and watched her ride east, and Ellen Cassidy came to stand beside him and said quietly, "Where did you find her?" "She found me," Ethan said. He turned away from the window before he'd tracked her out of sight, because standing at the window watching a person ride away was something he had not done since 1874, and he was not going to let himself start again. He went to work. He and Ellen went through her husband's documents with speed and precision. Clara's methodology already internalized enough that Ethan could apply it. He identified the key pages: the survey complaint, the appeal to the territorial office, the date-stamped correspondence with a county official who appeared in James Bennett's notes under a different context. He copied them in his own handwriting, signed as a witnessed copy by Ellen, added his own signature beside hers. Roy came in at some point with coffee and stood at the edge of the kitchen and said, "You want me on the road? I can ride south and watch for anyone coming up from Millhaven." Ethan looked at him. "Yes, if you see Dolan or any of Voss's men, come back fast. Don't engage them. Don't let them know you saw them." Roy went out. Ellen worked steadily beside Ethan, and at one point she said, without looking up from the document she was transcribing, "My husband came home from filing that complaint looking like a man who had just realized the house was built on the wrong ground. He didn't sleep for a week. He kept saying he must have misread the survey line, that maybe he'd made an error." She paused. He hadn't made an error. They made him doubt himself. That was part of it, making a person feel like they were imagining things. "And then he died," Ethan said. "And then he died." She said this without theatrical weight. Just the flat fact of it. Heart failure. He was 57 and healthy as a horse the year before. Ethan thought about James Bennett. Fever fast. 6 months after filing with the territorial office. He thought about this for exactly the amount of time it took him to make a decision. And then he put the thought aside because there was nothing to be done with it yet, and there was work in front of him that needed his whole attention. Clara came back. She came in through the back door with the waterproof box under her arm and mud on her boots, and her hair completely loose from whatever had been holding it. And she set the box on the table and opened it and checked that the oilcloth bundle was intact, and then she looked at what Ethan and Ellen had prepared, and she said, "That's good work. That's exactly right. How long do we have?" Ethan asked. "Not long. I saw dust on the South Road coming back. Could be nothing. Could be Roy spotted something and he's ahead of them." She was already unwrapping the oilcloth, already beginning to organize the originals alongside the copies. "We need to decide right now who's taking these to Helena." "I'll go," Ethan said. She looked up. "It's your ranch," she said. "If you leave, Roy stays. He's made his choice. He can watch the property." He said this with more confidence than he felt about Roy. But confidence was what the moment required. "Walt is already in Helena. I know the route, and I'm known in this county if Voss's men stop me on the road. A man on his own land has more standing than a woman accused of theft," Clara said. He stopped. "Yes," he said. "I was going to say that." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite anger, Not quite resignation, but the specific exhaustion of a person who spent their entire life having their limitations imposed from the outside. "Then we both go," she said. "The originals are what Cole needs. If you carry them, and something happens to you on the road, Voss gets them anyway. Two people are harder to stop than one." She looked at him with the directness he had come to understand was not stubbornness, but simply her particular form of clarity. "And Ethan, I have been alone in this for 4 months. I am done being alone in this." The kitchen was very quiet. Ellen Cassidy looked at her document and did not look up, which was its own form of courtesy. Ethan thought about standing on his porch with his hands in his pockets and 3 men on horseback coming through his fence. He thought about the specific calculation he had made in that moment, not heroism, not rescue, just the recognition of what was right and the decision to do it. "2 people are harder to stop than one, all right," he said. Roy came through the back door at a pace that said he hadn't been walking. "6 riders," he said, "South Road. 30 minutes out. Maybe less. Not Dolan, I didn't see Dolan. These are different men." Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the oilcloth bundle on the table. "How many horses can you have ready in 10 minutes? Clara asked Roy. 2, Roy said. 15 minutes for 3-2, Ethan had said. He looked at Ellen. "Mrs. Cassidy, can you stay here? Keep the copies visible on the table. Act like the originals are still here if anyone comes to the door. Don't lie, don't put yourself at legal risk. But let them search if they come, and let them find the copies. That buys us an hour while they determine what they have." Ellen Cassidy looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for an assignment. "Go," she said. "I've been here before, I can do this." Roy went to the barn at a run. Clara gathered the oilcloth bundle and her father's letter inside a second layer of canvas and tied it tight and put it inside the saddlebag that she slung over her shoulder. She looked around the kitchen at the table she had worked at since yesterday morning, at the window through which she had watched Voss's men search the property, at the stove where Ethan had made the first meal anyone had made for her in 4 months, without her having to ask. "Thank you," she said to Ellen. "Don't thank me," Ellen said. "When?" They went out through the back. Roy had both horses ready in 12 minutes. Ethan's done, and the bay Clara had ridden east, and he was cinching the last strap when he said, without turning around, the letter. "You still want me to send it if something?" "Still want you to send it," Ethan said. Roy tightened the strap. He didn't say anything else. He just stepped back and looked at the 2 horses and the 2 people about to ride them, and his face held the particular expression of a man standing at the boundary of who he was and who he is still deciding to be. Ethan put his foot in the stirrup. Clara was already mounted. She held the reins with one hand and the saddlebag with the other, and she looked at Roy and said, "Simply take care of this place." Roy met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." They rode north and then cut east along the back of the property, through the tree line, away from the south road, and the 6 riders coming up it. They rode at a pace that was fast enough to matter and controlled enough to sustain, because the distance to Helena was not a sprint, and they both knew it. The cottonwoods along the creek passed on their left, the spot where the waterproof box had been, now empty, its contents in the saddlebag against Clara's side. She didn't look back at the ranch. Ethan did once. The house, the barn, the outbuildings, the land that Margaret had loved and Grace had named horses on, and Ethan had stayed with when every reason to stay had gone. The land that someone had been quietly dismantling on paper for 18 months while he fixed irrigation lines and worried about his cattle and trusted the wrong man. He looked at it one more time. Then he faced forward. Beside him, Clara rode with her spine straight and her chin level, and the oilcloth bundle containing her father's work pressed against her side. And between the 2 of them was the particular silence of people who have run out of words for the moment, but have not run out of the reasons behind them. They had 2 days of hard riding ahead of them. They had 6 riders 30 minutes behind them who would eventually reach the ranch and find Ellen Cassidy sitting calmly at a kitchen table with copies of documents and no originals, and an expression that gave away nothing. They had Walt Carver in Helena and Garrett Cole, who had been building a case for 8 months and was waiting for the piece that completed it. They had James Bennett's evidence, his letter to his daughter, and his daughter's absolute refusal to let what he'd built and what he'd suffered count for nothing. What they did not have was certainty about what was waiting on the road ahead of them, whether Vaughan had men stationed at routes out of the county, whether someone in the county who had not shown their hand yet would show it, whether the 6 riders on the South Road were faster than Roy had estimated. Ethan rode and did not make the mistake of thinking ahead too far, because men who survived on the frontier survived by dealing with what was in front of them and not the 10 things that might come after. What was in front of him was a road north, and the woman riding it beside him, and the truth they were carrying. That was what he had. He decided it was enough to ride toward. They rode for 2 hours before the first problem found them. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It arrived the way most problems do on open ground, quietly, from a direction you weren't watching, in the shape of something ordinary that turns out to be anything but. A rider on the crossroad north of the Carver property, sitting still on a gray horse, not moving, not pretending to have business there, just watching the road with the specific patience of a man who has been told to wait and has been doing it long enough to get comfortable. Ethan saw him first. He kept his pace even and said, without turning his head toward Clara, rider at the crossroads, "Don't look directly." Clara looked at the horizons instead, the way a person does when they're thinking about something unrelated to what they're actually processing. How long has he been there? Long enough. He's not traveling. He's positioned. Voss anticipated the north route. Apparently. She thought for 3 seconds. The Creek Road. Does it connect north without crossing the main junction? It adds 4 miles and goes through Brewster ground. Do the Brewsters know you? Since they were boys. Then we take the Creek Road, she said. They turned before reaching the crossroads, moving at the same unhurried pace that people use when they've to do something different and don't want anyone watching to understand why. Ethan kept the turn casual, adjusting direction, the way a man does when he's reconsidered something practical. Not fleeing. They moved into the tree line, along the creek bank, and the crossroads rider disappeared from their angle of sight. "He'll report we turned," Clara said. "Yes. But he won't know where the Creek Road goes unless he knows this county well." "Does he, if Voss hired him locally?" "Yes, if he brought him in from outside." "We have to assume locally," Clara said. "We have to assume the worst version of every scenario and plan from there." Ethan looked at her. She said it like a fundamental principle, the kind of thing that gets learned from experience rather than taught. "How long have you been operating this way?" he asked. "Since about 2 weeks after my father died." She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "You start making decisions based on what you hope is true. You end up where hope runs out, and there's nothing underneath it. You make decisions based on what's most likely dangerous. You at least know what you're walking into." He didn't argue with this. He had lived on the frontier long enough to understand that optimism was a luxury and preparation was a practice. And the people who survived were not the ones who expected things to go well, but the ones who knew what to do when they didn't. The Creek Road was rougher and narrower, but the horses managed it without trouble. They moved through the Brewster property at the outer edge, far enough from the main house that they didn't need to stop, but close enough that Ethan recognized the fence line and the cattle markings, and knew exactly where they were. No one followed them. No second rider appeared at their back. That was either good fortune or a gap in Voss's coverage that they had found by accident. And Ethan was not going to use up energy being grateful for it. He was going to use the time it bought. They rode. The morning moved into afternoon, and the afternoon had a different character than the morning, the particular quality of hours spent in motion. Thinking, not talking much, because the kind of thinking that needed to happen didn't require conversation, and both of them understood this instinctively. They stopped once to water the horses at a creek crossing and to eat the food that Clara had packed with the same practical foresight she brought to everything. And they stood on opposite sides of the horses, and Ethan said, "Tell me about before." Before your father died, what was your life? She looked at him over her horse's back. Why? Because I've known you for 2 days. And I know what you're fighting for, and almost nothing about who you are when you're not fighting. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, I taught school. In Billings. 3rd and 4th grade, the age where children are old enough to understand that the world is complicated and young enough to still believe it's navigable. I liked that age, she paused. I liked the work. I was good at it. I had a room above the dry goods store, and I knew all my neighbors' names, and I made my own money, and She stopped. Enough, she said. I was enough. Not grand. Not the life I imagined at 20. But mine. Real. And you walked away from it. My father died, and someone tried to steal what he built, and I couldn't live with leaving that unanswered. She looked at him levelly. So yes, I walked away from it. Ethan thought about this. He thought about the version of Clara Bennett who lived above a dry goods store in Billings and taught children the alphabet and went home in the evenings to a life that was quiet and real, and hers. He thought about what it cost a person to leave, that not in the dramatic way of adventure, but in the grinding, unglamorous way of choosing a fight over your own comfort, because the alternative was complicity in your own loss. When this is over, he said, what do you go back to? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. I don't know, she said. The school gave my position to someone else after I didn't come back. The room is gone. The life I was building is. She made a small gesture with one hand. Paused, maybe. Or changed. She looked at the water moving over the creek stones. I've been so focused on not letting Voss win that I haven't let myself think much about what winning actually looks like. From the inside. Ethan nodded. He understood this more precisely than he could have explained. The entire 8 years since Margaret and Grace had been, in some sense, that being so focused on the next season, the next repair, the next thing that needed doing, that the question of what any of it was actually for had become something he moved around rather than through. They remounted and kept going. By late afternoon they had covered more ground than Ethan had projected. Because the horses were strong, and the detour had added miles, but not as many as he'd feared. They stopped at a ranch belonging to a man named Decker, who Ethan knew through a cattle trade 3 years back, not a friend exactly, but the kind of man whose handshake meant something and who kept his opinions close but his words solid. Decker gave them fresh horses without asking many questions. He looked at Clara with the evaluating courtesy of a man raised to be polite and smart enough to read a situation. And he asked Ethan, this county business or territory business? Territory, Ethan said. Decker nodded. Then ride fast, he said, and that was the end of it. They rode fast. The fresh horses made a significant difference, the kind of difference that reminded Ethan that the practical details were not separate from the larger stakes, but were, in fact, exactly what the larger stakes were made of. Every hour gained was an hour Voss didn't have to maneuver. Every mile covered was a mile closer to Gorgaret Coal and the machinery of legitimate authority that Voss had been working around for years but had not been able to stop entirely. They were an hour out from a town called Ridgeway, where Ethan knew they could stay the night when Clara said, "Someone's been following us since Decker's." Ethan didn't look back. How long? 20 minutes. Staying far enough back to not be obvious, but not far enough to disappear. She kept her voice calm and her posture easy. Single rider. Armed? I couldn't tell. Ethan thought quickly through the options available to them. Ridgeway was an hour ahead. Between here and there the road ran through 2 low crossings and one significant stretch of open ground where a following rider would have clear visibility from 3 directions. If the rider behind them meant harm, open ground was not where they wanted to be caught. There's a farmstead half a mile east, he said. Widow named Patterson. She's been there for 20 years. If we turn in a following rider, won't pursue onto private property if there's a witness, Clara said. Not unless he's authorized to, and if Voss had someone this far north with that kind of authorization, we'd know about it another way. Agreed. But we'd be stopping. We'd lose time. We'd also know who he is. She thought for exactly 2 seconds. Turn in. They turned off the main road toward the Patterson farmstead. And Ethan watched the following rider from the corner of his vision, without making it visible that he was watching Anderson. The rider hesitated at the turnoff, the specific hesitation of a person who has been maintaining a calculated distance, and is now recalculating, and then kept going on the main road, without turning. Ethan watched him pass. Young white hat. The horse was a roan that he didn't recognize. They circled back to the road after 5 minutes and resumed their pace. And Clara said, "He wasn't Voss's." "How do you know?" "Voss's men have been consistent in one thing: they don't hesitate. They've been operating in this county long enough that they're comfortable here." That rider hesitated. She paused. "He was watching us. But he wasn't sure who we were." "Sheriff Alderman," Ethan said slowly. "If Alderman got word that we left the ranch with documents, he might have his own interest in getting to them before they reach Helena. Alderman doesn't work for Voss directly. He works adjacent to him, protecting his own position more than serving Voss's interests specifically. If he thinks Cole is moving, he'd want to know what's in those documents before anyone else does." She looked at Ethan. "He'd want to know if his own name is in there, and is it?" "3 times, Clara said. They reached Ridgeway as the light was going. And they found the hotel without difficulty, a plain establishment that offered clean rooms and didn't ask unnecessary questions. And Ethan paid for 2 rooms, and they ate in the dining room at a corner table where they could see both the front door and the side entrance. Which was not the romantic frontier dinner that a storyteller might construct from the surface details, but was in fact 2 exhausted people eating hot food and watching doorways. But there were moments between the watching. Clara told him about a student she'd had, a girl of 9 named Ruth, who had memorized 12 multiplication tables in 2 weeks because she'd decided that numbers were a language, and she was going to be fluent in every language she encountered. She told this story with such specific affection that Ethan could picture the child exactly. And he laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded, and Clara looked at him with brief surprise when he did, as though she had not expected the sound of it. "You should do that more," she said. "Laugh? Yes. I've been told I'm not particularly known for it." "That's a waste," she said simply, and went back to her food. He sat with that for a while. After dinner, they reviewed the documents one more time, not because anything had changed, but because laying eyes on them was a reassurance that the ground was still solid under their feet. The oilcloth bundle in the saddlebag, James Bennett's meticulous records, the letter, Ellen Cassidy's testimony as Ethan had written it, folded inside and signed, the letter from Ethan himself, a second copy of the one Roy carried because Clara had insisted on a duplicate, and she had been right to insist. "Tomorrow," Clara said. "By tomorrow evening we could be in Cole's office, if nothing goes wrong." "Something will go wrong," she said. "Something always does. The question is whether it's something we can work around." She looked at the bundle on the table between them. "We've worked around everything so far, we have," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. "I want to say something, and I want to say it before tomorrow, because tomorrow I might not have the space to say it." He waited. "When I grabbed your wrist at that fence," she said, "I didn't know you. I was scared, and I needed someone to be between me and them. And you were there. That was the whole calculation." She paused. "But you made a choice that had nothing to do with that. You stood up for a stranger based on," she stopped, "recalibrated, based on who you are, and I have been—" Another pause. "And this one was different. This one was her, finding her way through something that didn't have easy language. I have been alone in this for 4 months, and I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand next to me. Not in front of me, next to me." Ethan held very still. "Clara," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. He waited. "Thank you," she said. "That's all. That's what I wanted to say." He looked at her across the table, with the documents between them and the saddlebag on the floor and the dining room, mostly empty around them, and the weight of everything they'd moved through in 2 days, sitting in the air between them like something with its own weather. "You ran toward my fence," he said, "not past it, toward it. You made a choice, too." She looked at him. "I was scared," she said again. "Brave people are scared," he said. "That's the whole point of it." She was quiet. Then she picked up the saddlebag and said good night and went upstairs. And Ethan sat at the corner table a few minutes longer and thought about things he was not quite ready to think about fully. And then he went upstairs too and slept the sleep of a man who has covered a great deal of ground and has more ground ahead of him. He woke at first light to the sound of someone in the hallway. Not footsteps passing through, footsteps stopping. Right outside his door. He was out of the bed and at the door in one motion. The way a man moves when 8 years of living alone on the frontier have turned light sleeping into a survival skill. And he opened it fast and found Clara in the hall, fully dressed, with her coat on and the saddlebag over her shoulder. "There's a man downstairs," she said quietly. "He arrived in the last hour." He asked the night clerk if 2 riders had come in from the south, a man and a woman. The clerk told him yes. "Who is he? I don't know. But he's sitting in the lobby, and he hasn't ordered anything, and he's watching the stairs." Ethan was dressed in under 3 minutes. He took the saddlebag from her shoulder and put it on his own, which she accepted without argument, and they went down the back stairs, the service stairs that the hotel used for laundry, and which exited through the kitchen, and out through the kitchen door into the alley behind the building. The horses were in the stable 2 doors down. They had them saddled in 10 minutes. Working in the particular silent coordination of people who have established the rhythm of shared urgency, and they were through the stable door and onto the back road before anyone from the lobby would have had time to notice. The stairs were empty. 2 streets over, Ethan circled back toward the main road and looked at the hotel front from a safe angle. The man from the lobby was standing on the front steps now, looking up and down the street, and even from a distance, Ethan recognized the particular quality of the posture a man who has lost something and is calculating which direction it went. He was not one of Dolan's men. He was not anyone Ethan had seen before. But his boots were the same style as the boots the rider on the roan horse had been wearing yesterday. Alderman's man. Not Voss. Alderman. "We have 2 different problems following us," Ethan said. "We always did," Clara said. "Voss wants the documents. Alderman wants to know what's in them." She looked at the man on the hotel steps. "They're not working together. Their interests overlap, but they don't align. If they were coordinating, there'd have been 1 effort, not 2, which means they're each trying to get there first, which means neither of them knows exactly what the other is doing." She turned her horse north. "Which means if we move right now, they spend time they don't have figuring out where we went. They moved." The last leg of the ride to Helena had a different quality from everything before it, the particular intensity of proximity, of being close enough to the end of something that the ending feels more fragile rather than less. Every mile felt more exposed. Every crossroad was a potential convergence. Ethan found himself tracking things his brain registered before his conscious attention caught up a rider on a parallel ridge. A dust cloud behind them that materialized and then dispersed. A man at a way station who watched them with slightly too much interest and then went back to his coffee. None of them became a problem. All of them could have. Clara rode with one hand on the saddlebag strap for the last 3 hours. Which was not something she was doing consciously. Ethan was certain of that. It was the physical expression of everything she was holding, the particular way the body finds to carry what the mind is trying to manage. He thought about her father's letter. Don't run toward danger. But don't run away from the truth either. Walk toward it straight. She had been walking toward it straight for 4 months. She was still walking. Helena came into view in the late afternoon, not dramatically. Not with any fanfare, just the way a destination arrives after a long ride. First as a smudge, then as shape, then as the specific details of a place where people live and conduct business and where. In a building on the east side of the main street, a man named Garrett Cole had been quietly and carefully building a case for 8 months and was waiting for the piece that would complete it. Walt Carver was waiting outside the land office building. He looked at them when they came up the street and something moved across his face that was too complicated for Ethan to name cleanly: relief and anger and something like respect, all combined. "You made it," Walt said. "We made it," Ethan said. Walt looked at Clara. "You've got the originals?" "Right here," she said. and patted the saddlebag. Walt nodded once, the nod of a man who has been holding his breath for 36 hours and is finally allowed to exhale. Cole is inside. He's been ready since yesterday. Walt stopped. What? Ethan said. He needs to tell you something before you go in, Walt said. Something he told me this morning that changes the picture. He looked between them. Something about your father, he said to Clara. Clara went absolutely still. Tell me, she said. Walt looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has been given difficult information to pass along and is measuring how to do it without causing more damage than the information itself. The first letter your father sent to Cole 8 months ago, Walt said. Cole received it. He started investigating quietly because he didn't want to tip Voss before he had enough to act. Standard procedure, don't move until you can move completely. He paused. But he also sent a letter back to your father. A private letter, confirming that he'd received the information and was acting on it, asking your father to hold tight and say nothing and trust the process. Clara looked at him. My father never received that letter, she said. No, Walt said. He didn't. The implication of this landed on all three of them simultaneously. If Cole had sent a letter to James Bennett, confirming that a territorial investigation was underway, and if James Bennett had never received that letter, then someone had intercepted it. Someone who monitored the Bennett property's mail. Someone who, upon reading that letter, understood that James Bennett had successfully reached a territorial investigator. Someone who then needed James Bennett to stop being a problem. Clara said very quietly he knew help was coming. My father knew and he died anyway. Clara. Walt started. Someone intercepted Cole's letter and gave it to Voss, she said. Her voice was controlled and was someone exercising deliberate force over what they're feeling. And then my father got sick and died fast. And Voss moved on the property 12 days later. She looked at the building in front of them. That's not coincidence, that's not fever. Ethan said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be adequate to this moment. He stood beside her on the street in Helena and let her stand in it without trying to pull her out of it. Because some things can only be survived by going through them and not around them. And Clara Bennett had been going through things rather than around them her entire life. After a long moment, she squared her shoulders. Who intercepted the letter? She asked Walt. Cole believes it was Fenner, Walt said. Fenner was also the notary. For your father's county mail records a position that gave him access to correspondence that came through official channels. It was part of the same network. Walt's jaw was tight. Cole has been trying to prove it for months. He needs the documentation you're carrying to complete the evidentiary chain. Clara looked at the door of the land office. Then, let's go complete it, she said. She walked up the steps and through the door, and Ethan followed her, and Walt followed him. And behind them, the street of Helena went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of what was about to happen inside that building, the meeting of evidence and authority that 4 months of running and 4 months of patient, quiet investigation had been building toward. Garrett Cole was a man of 53 who had the weathered look of someone who had spent a career dealing with the worst versions of human nature and had not become cynical about it by choice but hadn't been able to avoid it entirely either. He stood when they came in and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has been reading about a person through documents and is now encountering the actual human being those documents represent. Miss Bennett, he said. Mr. Cole, she said. They looked at each other for a moment, the investigator who had been quietly building the case, and the woman who had been running with the evidence, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The recognition of two people who have been, without knowing it, working toward the same point from opposite directions. Show me what you have, Cole said. Clara opened the saddlebag. She laid the oilcloth bundle on the table and unwrapped it with hands that were steady, and she began to speak. Not quickly, carefully, in the order that made the pattern clear, in the language that a man who dealt in evidence and legal process would understand and find unassailable. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. Cole asked 12 questions. They were precise questions. The kind asked by a man who is not looking for information but for confirmation, for the exact piece that locks the structure he's built into, something that will hold under examination. Each time she answered, he wrote something. Each time he wrote something. His posture changed slightly, the posture of a man whose case is getting stronger in real time. When she finished, Cole set his pen down. He looked at the documents spread across his table. He looked at Ethan's letter. He looked at the sworn statement from Ellen Cassidy. He looked at the copies Walt had brought 2 days before, and the originals that confirmed every detail. Then he looked at Clara. "Your father sent me the best preliminary account I received in 20 years of this work," he said. "And I sent him a letter that I should have ensured was delivered through a more secure channel. That failure is mine." He paused, and his voice had the careful weight of a man saying something he has thought about for a long time. Clara absorbed this. "Can you move now?" she asked. With this, he gestured at the table. "Yes. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He looked at Ethan. "Your property's deed situation, the operating agreement, and the water clause that falls squarely within territorial jurisdiction, given the pattern of fraud across county lines. We can move on that simultaneously." He looked back at Clara. "Fenner, Alderman, the 2 county officials whose names appear in your father's records." He tapped the paper. "Voss himself," Walt said. "All of them," Cole said. "That's the only way this holds. If we move on one and not the others, the network protects itself. We have to cut every line at once." Clara looked at the documents on the table, her father's handwriting. His dates, his names, his careful methodical record of what he had witnessed, and what he had feared, and what he had trusted his daughter to carry to exactly this room. She put her hand flat on the table, not on the papers. Beside them, just the table, as if she needed to feel that it was solid. "Then do it," she said. Ethan stood behind her and slightly to the side, not in front of her. Not beside her in a way that displaced her, and he watched Garrett Cole pick up his pen and begin the paperwork that would, by morning, change everything Harlan Voss believed about how untouchable he was. Outside, Helena moved through its evening. Ordinary life. Ordinary noise. Inside that office, James Bennett's work finally arrived at the place it had been trying to reach since the spring. And his daughter stood over it with her hand on the table and her spine straight, and her father's last instruction walked toward it, straight, fulfilled in every possible way. Ethan looked at her. He thought about standing on a porch with his hands in his pockets, and 3 riders at the gate, and a woman whose fingers locked around his wrist, like someone who had already survived everything except that one moment. He thought about 2 days ago. He thought it felt like a different world. He thought it felt like the beginning of something he didn't have a word for yet. He kept that thought to himself, because some things deserve more space than a land office, in Helena on the night they finally become possible. But he held it. He held it the way a person holds something they're not ready to put down. Cole moved that night, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The man stood up from his desk at 8:30 in the evening, put on his coat, walked to the door, and said to the 2 deputies who had been waiting in the outer office since Walt arrived 2 days ago, "Get the others. We ride in 1 hour." He looked back at Clara. "You'll stay here tonight. This building is the safest place in Helena right now. And I need you available to confirm identification if any of them dispute the documentation." "I'm not staying behind," Clara said. Cole looked at her without surprise, which suggested Walt had already told him something about her. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "you have been running for 4 months and riding for 2 days, and you are the most critical witness in a territorial fraud case that I intend to prosecute completely. If something happens to you on a ride tonight that does not require your physical presence, Fenner," she said. "You've described him from documentation. I've met him in person. Twice. If he tries to claim mistaken identity or disputes which documents he signed, I can identify him from direct experience in a way that paper cannot." She held Cole's gaze. "You need me there." Cole looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. Because this was not his argument to make, and Clara would not have thanked him for making it. Cole looked back at Clara. "You ride with me," he said. directly beside me. You do not separate from my position under any circumstance. Agreed? Agreed, she said. Ethan said, I'm writing too. Cole started to say something and Ethan said, the operating agreement against my deed is part of this case. Broken Creek is part of this case. I'm a named party in your documentation, and I have the right to be present when you move on the men who tried to take my land. He paused. And I'm going. Cole looked at both of them for a moment with the expression of a man who has accepted that some arguments are not worth the time they cost. 1 hour, he said, and went to brief his deputies. Walt put his hand on Ethan's shoulder in the doorway. You know this could go sideways. Voss isn't going to come quietly. Has anything gone the easy way so far? Ethan said. Walt thought about it. Fair point. They rode out of Helena at 9:30, with 8 territorial deputies and Cole at the front and Clara and Ethan just behind him. And the night was clear enough that the road was visible and the pace was fast and nobody talked, because the particular discipline of people riding toward a confrontation is a quiet one. You save what you have for what's coming. The plan Cole had laid out was simultaneous and specific. 3 locations, 3 teams, coordinated to arrive within 30 minutes of each other so that no one could send warning ahead. Fenner's home in Millhaven, Sheriff Alderman's office, and Voss's main property 6 miles east of town, the large ranch house, from which he ran what publicly appeared to be a legitimate land management company, and what the documents on Cole's desk proved to be a systematic fraud. Operation spanning 11 families and 8 years. Cole's primary team, which included Ethan and Clara, was going to Voss. Clara knew this before Cole said it. It was the only arrangement that made sense. Cole needed his most senior deputies at the primary target, and he needed Clara's ability to identify and contextualize documentation in real time if Voss produced counter-documentation, which a man of his preparation almost certainly would. She rode, and she did not let herself think ahead to the moment of confrontation, because thinking ahead to it was a way of spending energy she needed for when it actually arrived. Instead, she thought about her father. She thought about him sitting at the kitchen table with his lamp burning and his pen moving, writing down names and dates and amounts with the patient conviction that the truth documented is the truth preserved. She thought about his hands, which had been a working man's hands, strong and careful, the kind that built things to last. She thought about him wrapping those hands around a hen instead of a tool and deciding that what he was writing was the most important thing he could build. She thought, I'm finishing it, Dad. I'm right at the end of it. Voss's property was lit when they arrived, which meant someone inside was awake, which meant one of 2 things. Either Voss had been warned and was prepared, or Voss was simply a man who kept late hours, and tonight was ordinary business. Cole raised his hand and the column slowed. Standard approach, he said quietly to his deputies. Announced, lawful by the book. We give him every opportunity to respond correctly, and we document every moment he doesn't. One of the deputies said, You think he'll run? He's not a man who runs, Cole said. He's a man who argues. Have your paper ready. They rode to the gate and Cole called out loudly, clearly in the particular voice of a man exercising legitimate authority he has carried for a long time and is not uncertain about. Harlan Voss, Territorial Land Office, acting under territorial warrant. Open the gate. A long pause, long enough that Ethan's hand moved toward the rifle in his scabbard before he made a conscious decision about it. He let it rest there without going further. Then the gate opened. Not quickly. With the measured pace of a man who is making a statement, with his timing who is opening the gate because he has calculated that opening it serves him better than refusing it. Not because he has been given no choice. Voss himself came out onto the porch as they rode in. He was dressed, which confirmed he had been awake and working. He held nothing in his hands, which was either because he was not a physical man or because he was smart enough to understand that a territorial warrant with 8 deputies was not a situation where physical posturing helped. He looked at Cole. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Clara. His expression when he looked at Clara was the most complicated of the 3. It was the expression of a man who had sent men after this woman, had watched her slip through his fingers twice, had tried to use law and paper and time and distance, and was now looking at her standing inside his own gate with a territorial investigator beside her. It was not quite respect. It was something older than respect and less comfortable, the specific recognition a man like Voss has when he understands he has misjudged something fundamentally. "Mr. Cole," Voss said. "This is unexpected," Cole said, and dismounted. He handed his reins to a deputy and walked up the porch steps without invitation, which was a deliberate thing, entering Voss's space at Voss's door, without being asked and without hesitating, establishing from the first physical moment of the interaction exactly who had authority here. He produced the warrant. Voss took it. He read it with the careful attention of a man reading a legal document, not a man performing the appearance of reading one, which meant he was actually processing it and looking for the specific language, the specific scope, the specific place where it might be challengeable. His face changed as he read. Not dramatically. Voss was too controlled for drama. But there was a shift, a very slight reorganization of the muscles around his eyes and mouth that registered the scope of what the warrant covered. It was not a warrant for one fraudulent deed. It was not a warrant for one contested property. It covered 11 named families, 8 years, specific financial records, specific correspondence, specific notarized documents. It covered Gerald Fenner by name. It covered the subsidiary companies. It covered the operating agreement with Millhaven Land and Resource Partners. And at the bottom, under Cole's signature, was a notation that simultaneous warrants were being executed at 2 other locations within the county at this same hour. Voss looked up from the paper. "This based on the Bennett woman's stolen documents," he said. His voice was still controlled, still the voice of a man who believes the next 5 minutes can be managed. "This is based on 8 months of territorial investigation corroborated by documentation produced by multiple independent sources," Cole said. "Miss Bennett is one of 6 individuals who have provided evidence. The pattern exists independently of any single source." Something moved across Voss's face. 6 individuals, 7, as of this afternoon. Voss looked past Cole at Clara. She looked back at him. She had spent 4 months being afraid of this man. Not afraid of confronting him, she had never been afraid of that. Afraid that he would win. Afraid that the weight of his money and his connections and his patience would outlast her resources and her endurance, and she would end up standing in front of something she could not fight with the tools she had. She was not afraid of that anymore. She was standing in his yard with the territorial land office behind her and her father's documentation in Cole's hands, and the truth of everything Voss had done to 11 Swalm 12 now, counting the Cassidys arrayed in evidence that had been built carefully enough to survive every legal challenge he could construct. "You underestimated my father," she said. Her voice was clear and even, because she had earned the steadiness in it. "You assumed he was an isolated complaint. A nuisance. You sent Fenner to manage the paperwork and Alderman to discourage the inquiry, and you assumed that would be enough." She paused. "He documented everything you did. In the last months of his life, when he was sick and running out of time, he kept writing. He kept recording." She held Voss's gaze. "You could not outlast him. And you could not outlast me." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to Cole, "I'll need my lawyer present." "You'll have access to counsel," Cole said, "after we've completed the search of your records." Voss's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in the control. Small and brief, and quickly recovered. "Then I'll step aside," he said. And he stepped aside. It was that simple and that enormous simultaneously. A man who had taken 11 families' land through patient, systematic fraud stepping aside on his own porch because the paper Cole was holding was solid enough that fighting it tonight would only cost him more than it gained. He was not finished. Ethan understood this. A man with Voss's resources and legal connections was not neutralized in one night. The process ahead would be long and contested, and there would be lawyers and hearings and every procedural challenge available in the territorial legal system. But the wall had cracked. Cole's deputies went through the house. and what they found in Voss's records exceeded what even the documentation had suggested: a full accounting system, separate from the public books, that tracked every property transaction, every bribe payment, every official who had been paid to look away, every family that had been targeted, and the timeline of each acquisition. It was the record of a man so certain of his own impunity that he had documented his own crimes with the same precision James Bennett had used to document his observations. Clara stood in Voss's study and looked at the ledgers spread across his desk and felt something she had not felt in 4 months. It felt like solid ground. One of the deputies called from the inner office, "Cole, you need to see this." They all moved to the doorway. The deputy was holding a folder. Inside it was correspondence, a stack of letters. Organized by date, the deputy held up the top one. Cole read it. His expression changed. He looked at Clara. "This is a letter your father sent to Voss directly. Dated 3 weeks before your father's death." He turned it so she could see the date. "Your father wrote to Voss and told him that he had already contacted the Territorial Land Office and that an investigation was underway. He told Voss to cease his operations against the Valley families or face the full consequence of territorial law." Clara stared at the letter. "My father warned him," she said slowly. "He gave him a chance to stop," Cole said. "He was that kind of man." And Voss kept the letter, as evidence that Bennett had threatened him. His lawyers would have used it to establish that any subsequent action against Bennett was defensive, not aggressive. Cole's voice was flat. "It's the kind of calculation a man makes when he's certain he controls the outcome." Clara looked at the letter in Cole's hands, her father's handwriting, formal and precise, on paper that Harland Voss had kept in a folder in his desk for the month since James Bennett stopped being a problem. She thought about her father writing that letter, sitting at his table, already sick, hands that were starting to shake, writing to the man who was dismantling his neighbors' lives and telling him plainly that it was over. Not begging, not threatening in the way of a frightened man. Stating fact the way he always had, with the quiet conviction of someone who believed in the process even when the process was failing him. She thought, "He was never afraid of you. He was angry at you. There's a difference." "I want a copy of that letter," she said. "You'll have everything," Cole said. "When this is processed, every document from this house becomes part of the case record. And as a named victim's family member, you have standing to access it." He paused. "Your father will be part of the record of this case. Miss Bennett, what he built, what he tried to do. It will be in the official record." Clara pressed her hand flat against the doorframe. She did not cry. She had made her peace with the grief months ago, or as much peace as can be made with grief that is also anger and also love and also the specific ache of a daughter who did not get to say goodbye. She had made peace with it by walking toward the truth instead of away from it, which was the only thing she knew to do. She nodded once. Then she went back to work. They were there until 2 in the morning, cataloging and confirming. Ethan worked beside Cole's deputies without being asked, because there was work to be done, and he knew documents now. He had learned the language of them in the last 3 days, the particular way that people learn things when the cost of not learning is too high. He found 3 documents relating specifically to Broken Creek, the operating agreement with Millhaven Land and Resource Partners, a memo outlining the planned default timeline, and a letter from Fenner to Voss confirming that the deed corrections had been filed and that Ethan Caldwell had signed without challenge. He read that last one standing still in Voss's records room at 1 in the morning, and the anger that moved through him was not hot but cold, the particular cold anger of a man who has always done things the honest way and has just seen in specific written language how thoroughly that honesty was taken advantage of. He folded it and put it with Cole's materials. A deputy came in near 2 o'clock with news from the other teams. Fenner had been taken without incident, found at home in his nightclothes, who had, in the specific manner of a man whose courage exists only when he believes he is protected, immediately offered to provide a full accounting of his role in exchange for consideration in the prosecution. Alderman had been more resistant, had invoked his authority as county sheriff, had threatened to wire the governor, had eventually been presented with the specific documents bearing his own name in Voss's ledger and had gone very quiet. Both were in custody. Cole came to find Ethan and Clara at 2:30 and said, "Simply, it's done for tonight. The rest is process." They rode back toward Helena in the dark, and the ride was different from the one out, the particular quality of exhaustion and relief combined. The specific silence of people who have been running towards something for a long time and have now arrived and are not yet sure what arriving feels like. Clara rode beside Ethan, and at some point on that dark road she said, "Your deed." Cole said the operating agreement will be voided as part of the fraud settlement. "Your water rights revert to your original deed terms. I heard. Broken Creek is yours." "Clean." Yes, she was quiet for a moment. "How does that feel?" He thought about the right word for it. "Like something I should have been certain of all along, and wasn't. Like something coming back instead of arriving new." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "My father's land," she said. "The 40 acres. The debt against it was manufactured. Same as the others. Cole says the legal process to restore title to the estate will take time. But it's recoverable." She paused. "It's mine. What will you do with it?" Another pause. "Longer. I don't know yet. It's been so long since that was a real question that I've lost the habit of thinking about it." They rode. After a while Ethan said, "The school in Billings. Would you go back to it?" "They filled my position." "That wasn't what I asked." She considered this. "Teaching was good work. It mattered." She glanced at him. "But I'm not the same person who left for it. Going back to the same room above the same dry goods store, to the quiet life, I'm not sure that fits anymore." "What fits?" She looked at him. And in the dark he could see the shape of her expression, even without the details of it, the particular quality of a person who is thinking about something seriously rather than deflecting. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I need to stay still long enough to find out. I've been moving for 4 months." She paused. "I'm tired of moving." Something in Ethan's chest moved. He said, "Broken Creek is still." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and what was between them in that moment was not a declaration or a proposal or anything with clean edges. It was just a man who had stayed in a place through everything and a woman who had been running toward the right place without knowing what it looked like when she found it. And the space between them on a dark road where neither of them was moving away. "Is that an offer?" she said. "It's an observation," he said. "What you do with it is up to you." She turned forward and rode for a while without speaking. Then she said, "Your accounts are a disaster, I know. 3 years of filing errors in the cattle records alone, I know that too. Someone with an eye for numbers could spend the better part of a year straightening them out." "Probably longer," Ethan said. "I've been doing them wrong since Margaret died." She nodded slowly. "Like a woman making a decision she has been approaching for longer than she's admitted." "I'll need my own room," she said. "You already have one. And I'm not a housekeeper. I wasn't asking for one. And when this is over the case, the legal proceedings, all of it, I'll need time to work out what comes after. I'm not good at committing to something I haven't fully thought through." "Clara," Ethan said. She stopped. "I'm not asking you to commit to anything," he said. "I'm asking you to stay somewhere that isn't moving while you figure out what comes next. That's a different thing." She looked at him in the dark. "You are a very patient man," she said. "I've been alone for 8 years," he said. "I know how to wait for things that matter." She looked forward again. She rode. She said nothing else about it that night. And he didn't press it, because he was a man who understood that the most important things don't get resolved on a dark road at 2 in the morning after the longest 3 days of 2 people's lives. They get resolved in daylight, in the ordinary course of real time, by real people who are not running anymore. They returned to Helena, and they slept. And in the morning Cole had paperwork and questions that kept them both occupied through most of the day. And Walt sat in the corner of Cole's office drinking bad coffee and looking like a man who had decided that being present for this was worth whatever inconvenience it cost him. Roy Briggs had sent the letter. Cole confirmed this in the afternoon. The letter Ethan had written and given Roy to send by wire to Helena had arrived the previous morning and had been the final piece that allowed Cole to apply for the territorial warrants. Roy had sent it within an hour of Ethan and Clara riding out. Before Voss's men arrived at Broken Creek, before Ellen Cassidy sat down at the kitchen table to wait for them. Ellen, Cole reported, had been exceptionally unhelpful to Voss's men in the most legal way possible. She had offered them coffee, confirmed that yes, there were documents on the table, and allowed them to examine the copies while telling them with perfect serenity that she had no information about where the property owners had gone. She had done this for an hour and a half before Dolan figured out that the originals were not in that house and never had been. She enjoyed it, Walt said, with the tone of a man who respects what he's describing. She's been waiting for a moment like that since her husband died, Clara said. Cole looked up from his papers. Mrs. Cassidy's husband's case will be reopened as part of the pattern investigation. The circumstances of his death, he paused carefully, are among several items that will receive additional scrutiny. The room went quiet. Then Clara said, "And my father?" Cole set his pen down. He looked at her directly, which she had come to understand was his way of indicating that what he was about to say was important enough to give his full attention to. "The letter Fenner intercepted," he said. "The one I sent your father confirming the investigation. Fenner has already confirmed, as part of his cooperation, that he intercepted it and delivered it to Voss." Cole's voice was level but not neutral. "What Voss chose to do with the information contained in that letter, the information that your father had successfully reached a territorial investigator, is a matter that will be examined as part of the full case." He paused. "I cannot make you a promise I am not in a position to keep. But I can tell you that James Bennett's death will not be treated as incidental to this investigation." Clara looked at him for a long time. "He deserves that," she said. "He deserves to be counted." "He will be," Cole said. "What he built is the foundation of this case. Every family that gets their land back, and they will, that is because James Bennett sat at his kitchen table and wrote it down when he didn't have to. When it would have been easier not to." He held her gaze. "That will be in the record." Clara pressed her lips together and looked at the table and said nothing for a moment. Then she looked up and said, "Good." The legal proceedings that followed were not swift. They were not supposed to be. Cole had built his case to survive examination, and it did. It withstood Voss's legal team, withstood a challenge on jurisdictional grounds, withstood an attempt by the remaining county officials to argue that the warrants had been improperly served. It withstood all of it because the documentation was precise and corroborated and built by a man who had done this work for 20 years, and by a woman who had learned the language of evidence in the school of having no other option. Gerald Fenner's cooperation accelerated things. He produced internal correspondence that filled gaps Cole hadn't been able to close from the outside. Alderman, once he understood the scope of what Fenner had given up, followed. Neither man was going to escape consequence. But both of them made the timeline shorter than it would have been. And shorter mattered to 11 families who had been waiting a long time for something to move. Ethan rode home. He rode home after 5 days in Helena. After the warrants were confirmed and the first properties were legally frozen, pending title review, and Cole had what he needed for the next phase. He rode home because Broken Creek needed him. The cattle didn't care about territorial law, and Roy was capable but not indefinitely, and because the deed correction had been formally invalidated by territorial order and the water access notation in his original deed had been restored. Broken Creek was his again in every legal sense it had ever been his, and he needed to stand on it. Clara rode beside him. She had not announced this decision. She had simply, on the morning of the 5th day, appeared in the hotel lobby with her saddlebag and her oilcloth bundle, which she kept with her still. Because some habits of careful preservation don't end when the emergency does, and looked at him and said, "Ready?" He was ready. They rode home through country that was the same as it had been when they rode out, and entirely different in the way that places change when the weight that was pressing on them lifts. The same road, the same sky, the same creek crossings and fence lines, and the particular shape of the land that Ethan had memorized in 8 years of working it. Different, because what was following him now, riding beside him on the bay horse that had carried her east, through pasture and creek bed, and across 2 days of uncertain country, was not the same version of Alone that had followed him for 8 years. Roy Briggs was still at the ranch. He had stayed, which Ethan had not been certain of, and which mattered more than he expected. Roy was in the barn when they arrived, doing what Roy always did, being useful in a way that cost him something, and that nobody was watching. He came out when he heard the horses, and he looked at Ethan and said, "Everything's standing. No one came back after the first night." "Good," Ethan said. Roy looked at Clara. "You got what you needed in Helena?" "We got what we needed," she said. Roy nodded. He looked like a man who was still working out how to carry what he'd done, and what he'd chosen to do about it, which was probably how he'd look for a long time. That was appropriate. That was how a person who has done something wrong and then tried to correct it should look, not absolved. Not crushed, but accounting. "Roy," Ethan said. Roy looked at him. "I'm going to need a hand here longer than I planned," Ethan said. "Legal process is going to keep pulling me away from the ranch through the fall. If you're willing to stay and work honest, I'm willing to have you." Roy looked at him for a long moment. "Why? Because you sent the letter," Ethan said simply. "When it mattered, you sent it." Roy looked at the ground. Then he looked back up. "I'll stay," he said. Ethan nodded and went to unsaddle his horse. Ellen Cassidy came by that evening with food she had made, the specific gift of a practical woman who understands that people returning from 5 days of legal proceedings in another city have not been eating well, and she sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything and asked the questions that needed asking, and when she left, she said to Clara, "You should stay. This country needs people who know how to fight." Clara looked at her. "I'm thinking about it," she said. Ellen looked at Ethan. "She's thinking about it," Ethan said. Ellen Cassidy left with the particular expression of a woman who has assessed a situation and found it satisfactory. Weeks passed. The legal process moved in the way of legal processes with deliberate speed. With setbacks, with Voss's lawyers filing challenges that Cole systematically addressed, with depositions and hearings and documents flowing between Millhaven and Helena in a volume that kept Clara occupied in a way that was not so different from what she'd been doing, except that now the work was moving things forward rather than fighting to be heard. She worked from Ethan's kitchen table. She organized the case correspondence for Cole, who had written twice to say that her clarity in presenting documentation had materially advanced the timeline. She wrote detailed summaries of each family's situation for the title review process. She wrote letters, careful, precise, evidence letters to the families themselves, explaining what was happening and what to expect, because they deserved to know and no one else was telling them in language they could actually use. She stayed, not in the way of a decision made and announced, in the way of a person who starts doing something and then looks up one day and realizes that the doing of it has become the answer to a question she was still working out how to ask. One evening in the 3rd week, Ethan came in from the barn and found her at the table with a lamp lit and papers spread and a cup of coffee going cold beside her because she'd forgotten it. And she was reading something that wasn't case documentation. She was reading his wife's letters. She looked up when he came in. "I found them in the box when I retrieved the document," she said. "I should have told you. I'm sorry." He looked at the letters in her hands, Margaret's handwriting, which he had not been able to look at since 1874. He sat down across from her. "What are they about?" he said. Clara looked at the letters. "She writes about this place, about what she loved about it." She paused. "She writes about you." She looked up. "She says you are the most stubbornly kind man she's ever known. She says you do the right thing even when it costs you. And you don't talk about it, and that makes it mean more, not less." Ethan said nothing. Clara set the letters on the table between them. "She was right," she said quietly, "for what that's worth." He looked at the letters. Then he looked at her. "Keep them," he said, "or put them back. Whatever feels right to you." She looked at him steadily. "Why would I keep your wife's letters?" Because you're going to be here a while, he said. And this is her house too. It's all right for you to know her. Clara looked at him for a long time, the particular look of a woman who has spent 4 months being certain of nothing, and is now standing in a kitchen where something is becoming certain in a way she doesn't have quick language for. Ethan, she said. Clara, he said. She looked at the letters. She looked at the lamp. She looked at her own hands on the table. I'm not easy to live beside, she said. I know. I have opinions about things and I'm not quiet about them. I've noticed. I'm going to reorganize your entire filing system because it's genuinely terrible, and I cannot work around it anymore. I was hoping someone would. She looked up at him. What was on his face was not a performance. It was not the careful expression of a man managing a conversation. It was just Ethan Caldwell who had stayed in a place through everything. Looking at the woman who had run toward his fence line instead of past it, and who had turned out to be the person the place had been waiting for, without anyone knowing it. I'm not Margaret, she said. No, he said, you're Clara. That's who I'm sitting across from. She was quiet. Then she reached across the table and picked up her cold coffee and drank it without making a face about it being cold. Which was such a specific, unsentimental thing to do in that moment, that something in Ethan's chest unlocked with an almost audible quality. The filing system, she said. I'm starting tomorrow, all right, he said. And I want a better lamp for this table. This flickers. I'll get one. And your cattle records for the last 3 years are going to take me at least a month, I know. She put the cup down and looked at him. And what passed between them was not a grand gesture. It was not a declaration with dramatic language. It was 2 people sitting at a table in the lamplight, both of them having survived things that could have unmade them, choosing the quiet and radical act of staying in the same place at the same time. The families whose land had been taken began receiving notice of the title reviews in the weeks that followed. Ed Halsey, Walt's neighbor, the man who had spent 15 years on his ground and lost it in a week to Voss's manufactured debt, received his in November. Walt rode over to deliver it personally and said later that Ed had held the paper for a long time without speaking. And then he had said, in a voice that Walt described as being about 4 different things at once, "Tell me it's real." It's real, Walt had said. It was real. Harlan Voss's prosecution proceeded through the winter, and Gerald Fenner's cooperation produced enough additional evidence that 3 more county officials were added to the case before the spring thaw. Alderman resigned. Cole testified before a territorial review board about the structural vulnerabilities that had allowed the fraud to operate for 8 years. And several of his recommendations were adopted into territorial land law changes that made what Voss had done harder to do again, which was the most permanent form of justice available. James Bennett's name appeared in the territorial record as the original informant whose documentation had initiated the investigation. His 40 acres were restored to his estate and passed to his daughter by order of the title court in the spring. Unencumbered, clean hers. Clara held the title document for a long time when it arrived. Then she walked out to the east pasture where Ethan was working fence, and she stood beside him and showed it to him, and he read it and looked at her. "What will you do with it?" he asked. The same question he had asked months ago on a dark road. She had an answer now. "Keep it," she said. It was his. "It's mine. And someday," and what was in the pause was not uncertainty, but the particular spaciousness of a future that has finally opened up after a very long constriction. "Someday it'll be someone else's. Someone who deserves land that was held by people who fought for it." Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him. They stood in his east pasture with the fence between them and the morning around them, and all of it the fight. The loss, the running, the standing still, the documents buried under cottonwoods, the night in Helena, the letters on the kitchen table, the cold coffee and the flickering lamp, all of it settled into something that had been built rather than found, by 2 people who had each thought they were alone in it until they looked up and realized they weren't. The woman who had once whispered, "Please don't let them take me," at a fence post with 3 riders at her back, was not whispering anymore. She was standing in an east pasture in the Montana morning, with her father's land restored, and her own name in the record, and the truth documented, and the future open. And she was exactly where she had been running toward all along, not away from what was chasing her, but toward the place where she finally, completely, and without reservation belonged. And Ethan Caldwell, who had stayed in that place through 8 years of silence and loss, and the particular grief of a man who kept building things when he had forgotten what the building was for, finally understood what it was for. It was for this. It was for her. And Broken Creek Ranch, which had been a place of survival, and then a place of fighting, and then a place of waiting, became at last what it had always been capable of being, a place where two people who had both survived the worst version of alone chose each other every ordinary day and called that choice home.